Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you.
It was the kind of noise that jolts you from the edge of sleep, a hard, deliberate knock at the door. Anna's eyes snapped open in the pitch black of her bedroom. For a moment, she lay frozen, ears straining. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe she'd dreamed it. But then the knock came again, 3 sharp raps, each one sending a spike of unease through her chest. Anna's apartment was on the 4th floor of an old brownstone. The building was quiet, the kind of place where she rarely saw her neighbors and never heard a sound at night. Now, as the clock on her bedside table clicked over to 3:01 a.m., that silence felt heavy, pressing down on her. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. "Who the hell is knocking at this hour?" she muttered under her breath. She padded to the door, her bare feet cold against the wood floor. The hallway light was out again, just another quirk of her old building. She flicked the light switch twice, but nothing happened. With her phone flashlight in hand, she approached the front door. "Hello?" she called through the wood. No answer. Anna hesitated, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. Something felt off. Maybe it was the hour, or the silence that followed the knock, but a small voice in the back of her mind told her not to open the door. Instead, she leaned forward and peered through the peephole. The distorted fisheye view showed her an empty hallway. There was no one there. Her breath hitched. She was sure she'd heard it, not once, but twice. A deliberate, purposeful knock. She lingered at the door for another moment, her pulse thudding in her ears. When the third knock didn't come, she exhaled shakily and returned to bed. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the building's acoustics, or maybe even a neighbor playing a late-night prank. It didn't matter. By the time her head hit the pillow again, her nerves were still humming, and her sleep was restless at best. Anna woke the next morning feeling unrested. The strange knocking had kept her on edge, her dreams fragmented and unsettling. She shrugged it off as nothing more than a coincidence, an overactive imagination, combined with the loneliness of living alone in an old building. But when she reached for the door to pick up her daily newspaper, she found something else waiting for her. Tucked neatly under the front door was an envelope. It was brittle, yellowed with age, and sealed with a crusty wax crest that looked long since broken. She frowned. There was no name, no address, not even a postmark. Anna turned it over in her hands. Something about the envelope sent a ripple of unease through her. It wasn't the sort of thing people received in the 21st century. This belonged to another time. Slowly, she pried the envelope open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The parchment was just as old as the envelope, its edges crumbling under her fingertips. Written in spidery, uneven handwriting were the words, "Your bloodline is cursed. Beware the visitor." Anna's stomach churned. The words seemed absurd, almost laughable, like something out of a poorly made horror movie. Who in their right mind would leave a note like this? Was this someone's idea of a prank? She glanced down the hall, but the corridor was still, and the old walls absorbed every sound. There was no sign of anyone. She read the note again. "Your bloodline is cursed. Beware the visitor." The phrasing was peculiar, old-fashioned, like something out of a forgotten folktale. But who would go through the trouble of writing it by hand, sealing it in a decayed envelope, and slipping it under her door in the middle of the night? She placed the letter on her kitchen counter and tried to brush it off. It had to be some kind of joke, maybe left by someone who'd lived in the building before, or a disgruntled tenant who'd heard her footsteps and decided to mess with her. Anna resolved not to give it any more thought, but she couldn't help glancing at the envelope every time she passed the kitchen. It seemed to radiate unease, as though it didn't belong in the normal world. That night, as she lay in bed, the words came back to her. "Beware the visitor." It was so absurd, so ridiculous, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the note wasn't just a prank. It had a weight to it, a strange gravity that made her chest tighten. And when she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of knocks at the door, steady, deliberate, and woke up in a cold sweat. The envelope was still there on the counter, the letter inside it perfectly still, as though it was waiting for something to happen. By the time the third night rolled around, Anna had convinced herself that everything, her restless dreams, the note, the knocking, was a string of unrelated oddities. She tried to reason through it. The knocking could have been the building settling, the letter was probably a prank, and her anxiety was feeding her imagination. She stayed up late that evening, distracting herself with a stack of work she'd brought home. The whir of her laptop fan and the occasional hum of her refrigerator filled the apartment, keeping her grounded. By midnight, her shoulders ached and her eyes were bleary. Anna stood, stretched, and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she reached for the glass, a dull creak echoed from the hallway outside her apartment. Her hand froze mid-air. She stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. Another creak followed, louder this time, like the groan of old wood beneath deliberate steps. Anna's gaze darted toward the front door, her pulse quickening. Someone was out there, she was certain of it now. Moving quietly, she tiptoed over to the peephole and squinted through it. The narrow, distorted view of the corridor revealed no one. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear something, anything, but the hallway was silent again. The footsteps had stopped. Anna hesitated. She wanted to fling the door open, to prove to herself there was nothing there, but a gnawing fear rooted her in place. Instead, she flipped off the kitchen light, leaving her apartment in near darkness except for the faint glow from her laptop. She stood by the door, barely breathing. The hallway remained quiet. She leaned in once more, hoping that maybe the person, if there had even been a person, had left. Just as she was about to pull away, something flickered at the edge of the peephole's view. A movement so subtle, she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. Her heart thumped in her chest. She stared harder, her breath fogging the glass. But there was nothing. No movement now. The hallway was still. Anna stepped back from the door, her legs shaky. The sensation of being watched was hard to shake. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, she noticed something in the shadows near the living room. A faint outline, just at the edge of her vision, gone as soon as she tried to focus on it. Her breath caught. "Hello?" She called softly into the apartment. No response. The quiet hummed back at her. She stepped into the living room, flicking on the overhead light. The space was empty. Of course it was. But her unease hadn't left. Her eyes scanned the corners of the room, lingering on the spots where the light didn't reach. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that her imagination was running wild, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there just moments before. When Anna finally returned to her laptop, she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, searching the room for the flicker of a shadow, for a sign that she wasn't alone. Anna was roused from sleep at 2:47 a.m. by a sound she couldn't place. At first, she thought it might be her upstairs neighbor's TV playing too loud, an irritating occurrence, but nothing unusual. But the noise wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. It started as a faint whimpering, distant and muted. She tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over her head, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. Soon it wasn't just whimpering, it was crying. A deep, guttural sob that carried up through the floorboards and resonated through her small apartment. Anna sat up, blinking in the darkness. The cries were steady, rhythmic, and impossibly human. The sound unnerved her, too deliberate to be the wind, too emotional to be the creaks and groans of her old building. She slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, where she pressed her ear to the vent that led down into the basement. The crying was clearer here. It rose and fell in waves, as though someone were sitting just on the other side, sobbing into the darkness. Anna shivered. The basement was supposed to be sealed off. No one used it, not even for storage. The landlord had mentioned the door was locked, and the key was long lost. She called the landlord the next morning. Hey, I don't know if you know this, but someone's crying down in the basement. Maybe a stray cat got in? The landlord's voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost too calm. No one's been in that basement in years, he said, and it's locked up tight. No way a cat or anyone else could get down there. Anna frowned. But I heard. You're hearing the pipes, the landlord interrupted. This is an old building. The plumbing makes strange noises sometimes. No, Anna insisted. This wasn't the pipes. It was crying, like a person. There was a long silence. Finally, the landlord spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. Just ignore it. It's probably nothing. Anna hung up, feeling uneasy. The crying didn't come again during the day. But as soon as night fell, it started up once more. Louder this time and closer. She could hear it even when she wasn't near the vent. It carried up through the floor and into her living room. A steady, mournful wail that made her skin crawl. By the time she went to bed, the crying had become almost unbearable. She stuffed her ears with cotton and turned on a fan to drown it out, but it still reached her. A low, mournful sound that felt less like someone seeking help and more like someone warning her to stay away. Anna awoke the next morning feeling drained, her nerves raw from another sleepless night. The crying had finally stopped just before dawn, but its echoes lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that something wasn't right in her building. She spent the day keeping busy, trying to push the eerie sounds and the strange note from her thoughts. Maybe the landlord was right, she told herself. Old pipes, thin walls, things that had a perfectly logical explanation. By the time night fell, her unease had almost faded. She turned off her phone's ringer and left it on the coffee table, determined not to let any strange noises ruin another night's rest. But as she was brushing her teeth, her phone lit up, vibrating quietly against the table's surface. Her first thought was that it was a telemarketer. No one she knew called at this hour. But when she picked it up, the screen displayed unknown caller. Anna frowned. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something compelled her to swipe to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative. The line was silent at first, a faint static hum crackling in her ear. She almost hung up, but then she heard it, a whisper, faint and rasping. "Don't let it in." The voice was so quiet, so breathy, that for a moment she wasn't even sure she'd heard it. "What? Who is this?" she demanded, her pulse quickening. The static deepened, crackling louder. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Don't let it in." Anna's grip on the phone tightened. "Who are you? What do you mean?" No answer came. Just the low hiss of static, rising and falling like waves. Then the call disconnected. She stared at her phone, her heart thudding against her ribcage. Was it someone messing with her? Or was this connected to the note, to the knocking, to the crying she'd heard in the middle of the night? The thought made her stomach churn. Anna set the phone down and locked her front door before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. She couldn't shake the memory of the voice, its words looping in her mind. Don't let it in. At some point, exhaustion took over, and her dreams were filled with dark figures standing outside her apartment. knocking persistently, their whispers leaking through the cracks around the doorframe. When she woke up hours later, she felt no better than the day before, only more certain that whatever was happening was far from normal. Anna had lived in the apartment for 2 years, and the door at the end of the hallway had always been there. Unremarkable. Just a nondescript, white-painted door that her landlord had described as a storage closet. She'd never given it much thought. It was always locked, and she never heard anyone going in or out. But after the last few nights of knocking, whispering phone calls, and strange crying, the door began to feel different. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she caught herself staring at it. The apartment had settled into its usual quiet stillness, but the door seemed to draw her gaze. It stood at the end of the dim hallway, blending in with the other doors, and yet something about it felt off, like it was waiting for her. Shaking the feeling, Anna grabbed a glass of water and sat down to watch TV. She tried to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of her favorite show, but her mind kept wandering back to that door. Why had it never opened? Why had she never asked what was inside? Maybe it really was just storage, nothing unusual. But if that was the case, why was her chest tight every time she glanced down the hall? A loud knock shattered her thoughts. Anna nearly dropped her glass. It wasn't coming from her front door this time. It was coming from the door at the end of the hall. She froze, staring down the dim corridor. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. 3 measured raps, each one echoing faintly. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The air in the apartment seemed heavier now, pressing down on her shoulders and making it hard to think. She told herself it had to be her imagination, that the last few nights had gotten to her, but the knocking was unmistakable. She stood, her hands trembling, and took a tentative step down the hallway. The floor creaked beneath her bare feet. She was half tempted to call out, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she approached the door slowly, inch by inch, until she was close enough to touch it. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. The knocking stopped. Anna stood there, her heart pounding. The silence was so intense she could hear the faint hum of her refrigerator from the kitchen. She felt a sudden urge to yank the door open, to see what was inside. Maybe if she faced it head-on, she'd stop feeling so afraid. Maybe the only way to get past this was to prove to herself that it was nothing. But something held her back. A faint memory, her landlord's voice, casual but firm. "That's just a storage closet. It's locked anyway." The reminder of his words made her hesitate. She knew deep down that whatever was on the other side of the door, it wasn't something she wanted to see. Slowly, she stepped away, her back pressing against the opposite wall of the hallway. The door loomed before her, still and silent now. She didn't know what was behind it, But she knew one thing for certain. The knocking had been real, and whatever had made it was still out there, just waiting for her to open the door. Anna didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room, wrapped in a blanket, clutching her phone as if it could offer some form of protection. She left every light on and avoided looking down the hallway. Even with the door closed, the memory of that knocking, the deliberate, patient rhythm, made her skin crawl. It was just past 3 in the morning when the lights flickered. Anna's heart stuttered. She had never had electrical problems before. She stared at the lamp on the side table as it buzzed faintly, its bulb dimming for just a moment before returning to full brightness. The air in the apartment felt colder now, her breath catching in her throat. Trying to shake off the chill, she stood and crossed to the window. The city was still, the streets below bathed in the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. No traffic, no late-night pedestrians, just the quiet hum of an urban neighborhood at rest. For a moment, she thought maybe she'd imagined the flickering lights, that it was just her mind playing tricks on her after too many sleepless nights. And then she saw him. At first, Anna thought it was a trick of the light, but as her eyes focused, her breath caught. There was a figure standing on the sidewalk across the street, right under one of the street lamps. He was tall and thin, unnaturally so, and his skin was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light. He didn't move. He just stood there, facing her building, his head tilted upward as if looking straight at her. Anna felt her chest tighten. Her first instinct was to back away from the window, but she couldn't tear her eyes from him. His face was blank, too smooth, his features indistinct as though they'd been smudged. But it was his stillness that unnerved her the most. He didn't shift or fidget. He didn't look away. He just stood there, utterly motionless. Her hand gripped the edge of the window frame. She wanted to believe this was another trick of her tired mind, but the longer she stared, the more real he seemed. The light from the street lamp cast a faint shadow behind him, and she could make out the subtle rise and fall of his chest, as if he were breathing. But his gaze, or what should have been his gaze, never wavered. Anna reached for her phone. She fumbled with the camera, desperate to capture something that would prove she wasn't losing her mind. But as she raised the phone to take a picture, the figure moved. Not a step, not a turn, just the slight shift of his head, as though acknowledging her. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. When she glanced back out the window, he was gone. The sidewalk was empty. The street lamp buzzed faintly, its yellow light steady. Anna stared at the spot where he had been, her heart racing. She waited for him to reappear, but the sidewalk remained deserted. Slowly, she lowered her phone, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She backed away from the window, her pulse thundering in her ears. Whoever or whatever he was, Anna had the sickening feeling that he wasn't just passing by. He had been looking for her. She didn't know why, and she didn't want to find out, but in the pit of her stomach, she knew this wasn't over. Anna's dreams were dark that night, a swirling mix of the pale man's gaze and the shadowy hallway door. She woke drenched in sweat, her heart hammering as though she had run miles. For a few moments, she lay still, clutching the blankets and convincing herself that it was just another nightmare, nothing more. But as the morning light seeped in, something caught her eye. The bathroom door stood ajar, and the faint outline of her mirror was visible from bed. The glass was smeared. She stared for a long moment, her stomach tightening. The smudge didn't look random. It was dark red like dried blood, and it traced a symbol she couldn't place. It wasn't a word or a letter. It was a shape, a jagged looping rune that seemed deliberately drawn, a mark she'd never seen before. Anna's first thought was that someone had broken into her apartment, but she couldn't remember hearing anything, and the locks on the front door and the hallway door were still bolted. How could anyone have gotten in? Her second thought, that she'd somehow done this herself, maybe in a sleepwalking fit, was even more unsettling. Heart pounding, she rose from the bed and approached the bathroom. As she stepped into the small, tiled space, her gaze locked onto the mirror. The symbol was large, taking up nearly half the glass. She reached out to touch it, then stopped, hesitant. The smear was thick, slightly raised, and it felt wrong to put her fingers on it. Instead, she grabbed a washcloth, wet it, and started scrubbing. No matter how hard she wiped, the mark wouldn't come off. The cloth remained clean, as though the stain wasn't actually on the surface of the mirror, but somehow inside it. She pressed harder, her muscles aching as she tried again and again. But the rune stayed. It stared back at her like a warning, mocking her effort. Frustrated, Anna dropped the cloth into the sink. She stood back and glared at the mirror, her breath coming short and sharp. The symbol remained stubbornly vivid, as if it had been burned into the glass. Even as her brain scrambled for a logical explanation, maybe it was some kind of defect, an old marking brought out by moisture, her gut told her otherwise. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. For the rest of the day, Anna avoided the bathroom. She left the light off, the door closed, but that didn't help much. Every time she passed by, she could feel the rune waiting for her. She couldn't shake the sensation that it wasn't just a drawing. It was a message, and it was meant for her. That night, as darkness crept in and the strange noises began again, soft footsteps that seemed to wander the hall, Anna huddled in her living room. Her eyes kept drifting to the bathroom door, knowing that the mirror inside still bore the mark. Even with all the lights on, she felt like her apartment was cloaked in shadow, the air colder than it had ever been before. And when she finally drifted off to sleep on the couch, her dreams were filled with the pale man's face and that jagged looping rune. The apartment was stifling. Anna sat by the window, staring at the sidewalk below, as if the pale man might reappear. Her mind was a tangled web of fear and questions she couldn't answer. The mysterious knocking, the rune etched into her mirror, the distant cries at night, they were piling up, piece by piece, and none of them made sense. As evening settled in, she paced the room, unable to sit still. The clock ticked on the wall, marking each passing minute, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator served as a faint backdrop to her unease. Every so often, her eyes would flick toward the vent above the stove, a plain metal grate that hadn't caught her attention until now. It had been her lifeline during the summer, pumping in cool air and helping her endure the city's oppressive heat. But now, as winter loomed, she couldn't help but notice how the vent seemed to groan more than usual, the air pushing through with a faint whistle. For the first time, she wondered what lay behind it. What paths ran through her building, hidden by walls and plaster? She tried to focus on something else, but the sound pulled her attention. At first, she thought it was just the vent's normal hum. Then it shifted, a low, rhythmic noise, like breathing. She froze, tilting her head toward the grate. The faint rasp continued, rising and falling in time with her own breaths. Anna stepped closer, her skin crawling. She reached out, hand trembling, and placed her palm near the vent. The air was cold. She pressed her ear closer, her body stiff with fear. The breathing grew louder, unmistakable now. Then came the whisper. At first, it was just a garbled sound, as if someone was speaking from far away, but the words soon became clear. You can't escape. Anna stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The voice was hoarse, rasping, and far too close. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe her? She stood frozen, staring at the vent as the whisper repeated itself. You can't escape. Her mind raced. Could it be a neighbor? Someone messing with her? Speaking through the ductwork? But the voice didn't sound human. It carried a hollow, eerie quality, as though it came from something that didn't quite belong. Something ancient. The whisper stopped. The apartment was silent again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Anna remained where she was, unable to move, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't sleep that night, every muscle tense, her mind replaying the voice over and over. The vent remained still, quiet, as if nothing had happened. But she knew it had, and she knew it wasn't over. The next day, Anna felt like she was unraveling. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror, marked by that unyielding rune, looked pale and haunted. She avoided the hall after dark. She avoided the vent entirely. But no matter how much she tried to push everything aside, The fear followed her everywhere. It was under her skin now, an unshakable unease. In a desperate attempt to ground herself, Anna decided to sort through her old photo albums. They'd been boxed up since she moved into the apartment, shoved into the closet, and mostly forgotten. If she could lose herself in memories of simpler, happier times, maybe she could stop the panic from creeping up on her every time she heard the faintest sound in the apartment. She pulled a dusty album from the box, its corners worn and the pages slightly yellowed with age. She settled on the couch and began flipping through it, page by page. Old vacations, birthday parties, and afternoons with friends. Each photo brought a brief sense of normalcy. For the first time in days, she almost felt at ease. But then she turned the page. It was a picture from years ago, taken on a sunny day in her old neighborhood. She and her best friend had been walking to a local cafe, and they'd stopped by a small park. She remembered posing on the edge of a fountain, smiling at the camera. The fountain still sparkled in the background, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Her friend stood beside her, laughing, mid-conversation. It was the kind of moment she'd almost forgotten. Except there was something else in the photo. A man stood in the distance, just beyond the edge of the fountain. He was pale, startlingly pale. His features were blurry, indistinct, but the outline of his thin frame was clear. He wasn't facing the camera. He was facing her. Anna's stomach clenched. She leaned closer to the photograph, trying to make out the man's face. But the more she stared, the more unreal he looked. He seemed too tall, his posture too stiff. And even though the photo was years old, she recognized that silhouette, that shape. It was the same figure she'd seen beneath the street lamp, the same man who had stared up at her apartment. She flipped the page quickly, her hands trembling. The next photo was from the same day, a shot of the cafe patio. Her friend sat at the table, holding an iced coffee, chatting away. And there, reflected in the window of the cafe, was the pale man again. His outline was distorted in the glass, but unmistakable. He was watching them. Anna slammed the album shut, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. How was that possible? That picture had been taken years ago, long before she'd moved into this apartment, long before the knocking and the vent whispers and the symbol on the mirror. But he was there. He had always been there. Her hands shook as she set the album aside, pushing it to the far end of the couch. She didn't want to look through the rest. She couldn't. The thought of finding more photos, more proof that he had been following her, silently watching from the background of her life, was too much. She sat back, staring at the closed album. Even with it shut tight, she could feel the weight of those images pressing on her, a dark certainty settling in her chest. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't random. Somehow, the pale man had always been a part of her story, even if she'd never seen him before now. Anna stayed awake all night, sitting on the couch, her eyes darting to every shadow and corner. She didn't dare turn the lights off. She didn't dare close her eyes. The apartment grew quieter with each passing day, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Anna no longer knew what time it was without checking her phone. The sunlight filtering through her curtains felt thin and gray, and every minute dragged on endlessly. She tried to distract herself, turning the television on to fill the empty air, sifting through old books and magazines, but nothing helped. The silence pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. That night, just after midnight, she heard it. A soft, deliberate creak. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the vent, but from the floor beneath her. Her stomach tightened as the sound came again, wood groaning, like a door slowly shifting on its hinges. She held her breath, waiting, listening. When the sound came a third time, she couldn't ignore it. It was coming from the basement. Anna tried to remember what the landlord had told her when she'd moved in. Something about the basement being locked up years ago. No one used it anymore. The door was sealed, the space forgotten. But if that was true, why did it sound as if it was opening now? Her instincts told her not to look, to lock her bedroom door and stay under the covers until morning. But a part of her needed to know, needed to see if the strange sounds and the whispers and the pale man's eerie presence all tied back to that forgotten basement. She couldn't let the not knowing gnaw at her any longer. Her heart pounded as she threw on a coat and grabbed her phone, clutching it tightly as she stepped into the hallway. The air out there felt colder, heavier. The carpeted floor muffled her footsteps, but her breathing seemed deafening in the stillness. She crept down the hall to the stairs leading to the basement. She'd never gone down there before. In her mind, the door had always been closed, covered in layers of chipped paint, its keyhole filled with years of dust. But when she turned the corner, the door was ajar. Not much, just a crack wide enough to see the darkness beyond. The following morning, Anna felt like a shell of herself. Her nights had become endless vigils, spent clutching her phone and listening for the faintest sounds. She paced her apartment, her mind unable to latch onto any reassuring thoughts. She wanted to call someone, to invite a friend over, to confide in a neighbor, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what had been happening. How could she tell someone about the pale man, the whispers, the rune on her mirror, or the shifting shadow in the basement without sounding insane? That day, she left the apartment for the first time in what felt like weeks. The air outside was crisp and cold, the city streets alive with people who had no idea what haunted her nights. Anna bought coffee from her usual cafe and sat by the window, watching cars and pedestrians pass by. For a moment, she felt normal again. She even thought about calling her sister, just to hear a familiar voice. Then she glanced toward the corner of the cafe and froze. A man was standing there, tall and thin, with skin that was almost translucent. His face was turned away from her, but she recognized his stillness immediately. The coffee cup slipped from her hands, splashing across the table. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, as the man slowly turned his head toward her. His face was wrong. His features were faint, as though blurred by a haze. His eyes, if they were eyes, were empty hollows, dark and endless. There was no expression, no human trace, just a blank stare that made her chest feel tight and her knees weak. She ran. She pushed through the cafe's doors and into the street, the cold air biting at her cheeks. She didn't look back. Her heart raced as she dodged pedestrians, her breath puffing out in frantic bursts. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, her keys trembling in her hand as she unlocked the door. Once inside, she slammed the door behind her and locked it, leaning against the solid wood as if that could keep him out. She paced the living room, her mind reeling. Had it really been him? How could he be here, out in the open, in daylight? She pressed her palms to her face, trying to block out the memory of that hollow gaze. But it stayed with her, vivid and unshakable. As the afternoon stretched on, Anna avoided her mirrors. She drew the curtains tight. But even as the shadows lengthened and the apartment grew darker, she felt those empty eyes following her. She could still see him standing silently at the cafe, turning slowly to face her. When night fell, she turned every light on. The apartment glowed like a beacon, but the brightness didn't make her feel safe. In fact, it made the shadows seem darker. Every corner seemed deeper, every reflection in the glass windows more ominous. It wasn't until she glanced at the window in her living room that she noticed something that made her skin crawl. It was faint, like the trace of a handprint smeared on the glass. She leaned closer, squinting at the faint outline. It wasn't a handprint, it was a face. The hollow, empty eyes stared back at her, and before she could scream, it faded, disappearing into the glass as though it had never been there. Anna froze. Her first instinct was to run, to lock herself in her apartment and pretend she hadn't seen it. But the darkness behind the door seemed to call her, a black void that promised answers or maybe more questions. Against every ounce of self-preservation screaming in her head, she stepped closer. The smell hit her first. Dampness, like wet earth and mold, seeped from the basement door. It carried with it a faint metallic tang, something sharp and unpleasant. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the door, trembling, and then she pushed it open a little farther. The stairway beyond was narrow and steep, descending into shadow. Her phone's flashlight barely pierced the darkness, illuminating cracked concrete walls and sagging wooden steps. She couldn't see the bottom, but the air grew colder as she stood there, her breath visible in the faint beam of light. She listened, straining for any sound. For a moment, it seemed as though the basement was silent, nothing but her own shallow breathing filling her ears. Then, from far below, she heard a faint shuffling. It wasn't footsteps exactly, it was softer, more deliberate, as though someone or something was moving just out of sight. Anna's grip on her phone tightened. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to turn around, to shut the door and never come back. But she couldn't. Something down there was waiting. Something she felt she needed to face, even if she didn't know why. Her foot hesitated on the top step, her pulse hammering. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the dim light from her phone. She leaned forward just slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving below. And then, in the darkness, she saw it. A figure barely visible, shifting at the bottom of the stairs. Its shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, and its pale skin seemed to gleam faintly in the darkness. It turned toward her, slowly, and even though she couldn't see its eyes, she felt its gaze lock onto hers. Anna stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The figure began to ascend, one step at a time, the sound of its movement a soft, deliberate scrape. She slammed the basement door shut, her hands shaking as she twisted the lock. She leaned against the door, her heart racing, the faint sound of shuffling steps still echoing behind it. She didn't know how long she stood there, pressed against the door, waiting. When the noises finally stopped, she ran back to her apartment, locking herself inside. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she sat on the couch, staring at the door down the hall. The basement door had opened. Something had been waiting there, and now it was no longer content to stay below. The next morning, Anna found another letter slipped beneath her door. This one wasn't old or yellowed. The envelope was stark white, the paper crisp. Her hands shook as she picked it up. For a moment, she considered leaving it sealed, but curiosity and fear pushed her to tear it open. "You've let it in. It's too late now." Her breath hitched. The words were simple, but the weight of them bore down on her. Anna stared at the paper, the ink smudging slightly under her thumb. Who had left it? The landlord never mentioned anyone else having keys, and her front door had been locked all night. Yet somehow this warning had appeared, and it was addressed to her. All day, she waited for something to happen. She avoided her mirrors, kept the lights on, and tried to convince herself that she was still in control. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The empty eyes haunted her every thought. It was as though the pale man's gaze had become a permanent shadow in her mind, a weight she couldn't shake. By evening, Anna could barely eat. The idea that she had let it in, whatever it was, gnawed at her. She racked her brain, thinking of all the times she might have opened herself to something. The knocking, the vent, the basement door. Had she broken some kind of boundary without realizing it? When night fell, the apartment seemed colder than usual. She double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, trying to convince herself she was safe. But at 3 a.m., she woke to find her bedroom door wide open. Anna sat bolt upright, her pulse hammering. She had closed it before going to bed. She was sure of it. The hallway beyond was dark, a faint draft brushing against her bare arms. Her chest tightened as she strained to hear something, anything, but the apartment was silent, too silent. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the open door. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Slowly she swung her legs out of bed, the floor cold against her feet. She took a step toward the door, then froze. Her front door was ajar. Anna's breath caught. She stared at the open door, her mind reeling. The locks had been secured. She had checked them, twice. There was no way anyone could have come in. Yet the door now gaped open, revealing the dim hallway beyond. The air out there seemed thicker, almost suffocating. It felt as though something was waiting, just out of sight. Her body trembled as she stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The hallway seemed endless now, the shadows stretching far beyond what she knew was possible. She called out, her voice shaky. "Who's there?" No response. Anna's pulse pounded in her ears. She considered running back into her bedroom and locking herself inside, but she knew deep down that wouldn't stop whatever had come inside. The note had warned her, but she hadn't understood. Now it was here, and it wasn't leaving. Anna stood frozen in her bedroom doorway, her flashlight beam trembling as it lit up the open front door. The hallway beyond was dark and still. Her instincts screamed at her to lock herself inside, to call for help, but her phone was dead. The charger, inexplicably, wouldn't work. She was alone, and she could feel the weight of that fact pressing down on her. Then, faintly, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy for a normal person. They didn't echo like they should have in the narrow hallway. Instead, they seemed to drag the air with them, pulling it closer with each step. She couldn't bring herself to move. Her legs felt rooted in place, as if the very floor beneath her feet had turned to glue. The pale man's silhouette emerged from the shadows. He stepped through the open door, one impossibly long leg at a time. He didn't walk like a man. His movements were too fluid, too quiet, as though the laws of motion didn't apply to him. Anna's breathing quickened. The flashlight beam danced on his figure, revealing skin so white it almost seemed to glow. His face was as smooth and empty as before. No eyes, no mouth, just an unsettling blankness where features should have been. And yet she felt his gaze on her, piercing through her skin and bone, digging into her very core. The flashlight began to flicker. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum that had started filling the room. It was low at first, like distant static, but it grew louder with every passing second. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the beam of light. She stumbled back into her bedroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might stop altogether. The pale man moved forward, his smooth, eyeless face tilting as if he was studying her. The hum turned into a deep, resonant sound, something that vibrated inside her chest, making her teeth chatter. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight, even as it began to dim. Shadows crawled along the walls, their shapes twisting and contorting, reaching for her. "Please," she croaked, though she didn't know what she was pleading for. Her words were swallowed by the hum, which now resembled the sound of distant screams, muffled and distorted. Her legs gave out, and she slid to the floor, the flashlight clattering beside her. The pale man crouched down, impossibly tall even in this position. He tilted his head again, as if considering her. Then, for the first time, he moved in a way she understood. A slow reach of one long, pale hand. Anna tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere left to go. The room seemed to shrink around her. The walls drew closer, and the shadows that danced across them began to take on horrifying shapes. Faces, mouths, hollow eyes. She squeezed her own eyes shut, trying to block it all out. The hum became a roar. The cold grew so intense that it burned. She felt the pale man's presence loom over her, the void of his face only inches from hers. And then he whispered something. No words, just a sound like air rushing through dead leaves. It sliced into her mind, sharp and invasive. Anna screamed. Anna screamed. And then the flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The air turned frigid, and Anna's scream died in her throat as her voice hit an unseen wall. She could feel the pale man's presence, even though she couldn't see him anymore. It pressed against her, a crushing, silent weight. Her entire body trembled, cold sweat clinging to her skin, as if the darkness itself had seeped into her pores. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. No more hum, no footsteps, no whispers, just the suffocating quiet. Anna tried to move, to scramble back to her feet, but it was as if the room was holding her down. Her limbs wouldn't respond. She could only sit there, curled into the corner, as the void seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, a sound, a faint tapping, like nails against glass. It wasn't the pale man. She was sure of that. It was coming from somewhere else, deeper, farther. The noise grew louder, morphing into a sharp, rhythmic pounding that rattled the very air around her. The walls of the room shifted, bending inward like the apartment itself was collapsing into the darkness. Anna's thoughts raced. She tried to remember how she'd ended up here. The knocking, the rune on the mirror, the whisper in the vent, the photograph, the pale man under the streetlight. It all flooded back, disjointed and overwhelming. It was as if she'd been caught in a web, each strand pulling her deeper into something she couldn't escape. The shadows around her started to move. At first, they seemed random, shapeless, but as her eyes adjusted to the faintest hints of light, if it was even light, she began to see them taking form. Faces, eyes, empty sockets staring back at her, mouths frozen open in silent screams. The shadows whispered, their voices low and fragmented. It wasn't words they were saying, but she understood all the same. "You don't leave. You can't leave." Anna tried to speak, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness pulled tighter, and the shadows drew closer, until they were brushing against her skin. The air grew so cold that her breath came out in short, sharp gasps. The pale man's presence was still there. She could feel it looming behind her, unrelenting. But now, the shadows were part of him, or he was part of them. She couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Something changed. A shift in the air, a strange vibration, as if reality itself was unraveling. The apartment walls melted into the dark, leaving Anna in a void that stretched endlessly. Her flashlight was gone. The sound of her own breathing faded, until all that remained was the oppressive weight of emptiness. She closed her eyes tightly, silently begging for it all to stop, for her to wake up. And then, nothing. When Anna opened her eyes again, she wasn't in her apartment. She wasn't in the building. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. The void had consumed her entirely. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling. Just a vast, endless blackness. The pale man's figure stood in the distance, motionless, waiting. She tried to speak, but her voice didn't come. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. There was nothing to run on, nowhere to go. She was weightless, adrift, yet trapped. The pale man tilted his head, just as he had in the apartment, as though studying her, and then slowly he faded. His blank form dissolved into the void, piece by piece, until he was gone. But the weight of his gaze lingered, etched into her mind. She was alone now, or at least, that's what she thought. The shadows started to shift again. They didn't come for her. Not yet. They hovered at the edges of her vision, moving closer with unbearable slowness, whispering things she couldn't understand. Anna felt her pulse quicken, but the familiar thrum of her heartbeat was absent. The last vestiges of normalcy had vanished. She reached out blindly, hoping to feel something, anything, but her hands touched only air. A single whisper rose above the others. It wasn't the pale man's voice. It was deeper, older, resonating with something primal inside her. The words were faint, but this time they were unmistakable. "You never should have let him in." The shadows closed in.
Night, a relentless downpour that blurred the road ahead. Emily Turner tightened her grip on the steering wheel, squinting through the sheets of rain as her car wound its way through the dense, fog-shrouded forest. The trees loomed on either side like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching out as if trying to snatch her from the safety of her vehicle. She hadn't been to Hollow Ridge since she was a child, visiting with her parents for some distant relative's funeral she barely remembered. The town had always felt eerie, like a place trapped in time, with its crumbling buildings and cobblestone streets that echoed with whispers of the past. But now, with her parents gone, the dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town was all she had left. As she drove, the GPS on her phone blinked erratically, losing its signal, leaving her to navigate the dark and unfamiliar roads by memory alone. "Almost there," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. The house had come as a surprise, a cryptic mention in her parents' will. She hadn't even known they owned property out here. But with their sudden deaths, leaving her lost and grieving, the thought of starting fresh in a new place, far from the suffocating memories of her childhood home, seemed almost appealing. Emily's car finally broke through the thick mist, revealing the silhouette of the mansion up ahead. Hollow Ridge Manor stood tall and imposing, its Gothic spires piercing the dark sky. The front gate creaked open with an unnerving groan as she nudged it with the car's bumper, as if the house had been waiting for her. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, the scent strong enough to seep through the closed windows. Pulling up to the gravel driveway, Emily killed the engine, and silence enveloped her like a shroud. For a moment, all she could hear was the heavy patter of rain against the car roof. The mansion loomed over her, its blackened windows like soulless eyes staring into her very being. She hesitated, her hand on the door handle, before finally stepping out into the cold night air. She shivered as she hurried to the front porch, fumbling with the old brass key she had found in an envelope left on her parents' desk. The key fit perfectly, turning with a loud click that echoed through the empty corridors beyond the door. With a deep breath, she pushed it open, the heavy oak door creaking in protest. Inside, the house was a tomb of darkness. She flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Figures, she sighed, realizing the electricity was probably cut off. The beam of her flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing a grand foyer filled with dust-covered furniture draped in white sheets. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the musty smell of abandonment. As she stepped inside, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud, making her jump. She turned quickly, her flashlight beam swinging wildly, but saw nothing but the heavy door, now firmly closed. Taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart, she told herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking underfoot like the groans of an old man. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring out with cold, unseeing eyes. The faces seemed to follow her as she made her way through the maze of hallways, each turn taking her deeper into the heart of the house. Finally, she found her way to what appeared to be the living room. The fireplace was cold and empty, but at least it was a space that felt somewhat less oppressive. She set her bags down, dust billowing up around her. Exhausted from the long drive, she decided to explore more in the morning. But as she turned to head upstairs, she heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath against her ear. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Emily, her name, barely more than a murmur, carried on the still air. She spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The house was silent again, save for the steady beat of her own panicked heart. "Must be the wind," she whispered to herself, trying to sound convincing. But as she made her way up the grand staircase, the whispers seemed to follow her, echoing softly through the cavernous halls. It was as though the house itself was trying to speak to her. Reaching the master bedroom, Emily found it just as neglected as the rest of the house. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the once grand bed was draped in a faded canopy. She set her flashlight on the nightstand and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to care about the dust. She would clean it up tomorrow. As she lay there, trying to drift off to sleep, the whispering began again, now clearer, more insistent. It seemed to seep from the walls, a chorus of disembodied voices that grew louder as the wind howled outside. "We've been waiting." Emily bolted upright, her heart racing. The voices stopped immediately, as if cut off by an unseen hand. Silence settled over the room once more, thick and heavy. She lay back down, pulling the dusty covers over her head like a frightened child, willing herself to believe it was all in her imagination. But the feeling of being watched never went away. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of the house, something shifted. The mansion, long dormant, was waking up. The morning light filtered weakly through the grime-coated windows, casting a sickly yellow glow over the dusty interior of the mansion. Emily woke with a start, her heart still pounding from the restless sleep that had been filled with strange, half-remembered dreams. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing at the foot of her bed, watching her through the long hours of the night. She shook off the unsettling thoughts and tried to focus. Today was supposed to be the start of her new life here. The first order of business was getting the electricity and water running, so she could make the house at least somewhat livable. But as she padded down the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness, the events of the previous night nagged at her mind. The house felt different in the light of day, but not necessarily better. The shadows, though softer now, seemed to linger in the corners like dark stains that refused to be erased. Emily made her way into the kitchen, where she found an old fuse box mounted on the wall. After a few minutes of fiddling with it, she managed to restore power. The overhead lights flickered on, their dull glow casting a sickly light over the ancient countertops. Satisfied, she set about making herself a quick breakfast from the supplies she had brought along. But as she stood at the counter, a sudden sound cut through the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. She turned, her eyes scanning the kitchen, but there was nothing there. The sound seemed to come from above, perhaps the attic or one of the upper rooms. Old houses make noises, she reminded herself, trying to sound calm. It's just settling. Still, the tapping continued intermittently, seeming to follow her as she moved through the house. It stopped only when she ventured into the large, dusty library. She had been curious about it since the moment she arrived. Its towering bookshelves and ancient tomes hinted at secrets long forgotten. As she walked deeper into the room, her fingers trailed along the spines of books that hadn't been touched in decades. One book caught her eye, its leather cover cracked and worn, with no title on the spine. She pulled it off the shelf, coughing as a cloud of dust erupted around her. Inside, the pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams that made no sense to her. Some of the pages were torn out, and in the margins, someone had scribbled frantic notes. The voices grow louder each night. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she read the line. It was written in a shaky hand, as if the writer had been in a state of panic. She quickly closed the book, shoving it back onto the shelf, and tried to push down the rising sense of dread that clawed at her stomach. Determined to distract herself, she decided to start cleaning up the house. She dragged an old broom from the closet and set to work sweeping the foyer, humming a tune to keep herself company. But every now and then, she'd pause, convinced she heard something like the faintest whisper of a conversation coming from the walls. She couldn't make out the words, but there was a distinct tone, a low murmur that sent chills down her spine. By late afternoon, the house was still an overwhelming mess, but at least she had cleared a path through the layers of dust and cobwebs. Exhausted, she decided to take a break and explore the rest of the mansion. Perhaps fresh air from opening a few windows would dispel the eerie atmosphere that seemed to cling to her skin like a damp shroud. As she ventured into the west wing, the whispers returned, this time louder and more distinct. They were coming from behind a door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door itself was unlike any of the others in the house. It was thick, reinforced with iron bands, and looked completely out of place in the otherwise stately mansion. Taking a deep breath, Emily tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The whispers on the other side grew more urgent, like multiple voices arguing, their words garbled and overlapping. Emily pressed her ear against the door, straining to catch even a hint of what they were saying. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was so jarring that Emily stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. The hair on her arms stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She turned to leave, intending to get as far away from that door as possible. But just as she did, she heard it again, a soft, breathy voice, so close it felt like it was right behind her ear. "Help us!" Emily spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping the darkened hallway, but she was alone. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she tried to calm herself down. "It's just the wind," she repeated under her breath. "Old houses make noises." But deep down, she knew it wasn't the wind. There was something trapped behind that door, something that desperately wanted out. Trying to shake off the fear, she hurried back to the kitchen. As she reached for her phone to call a locksmith, she noticed it had no signal again, despite having full bars earlier in the day. Frustrated, she set it down and tried to focus on the tasks at hand. The day wore on, and as the sun began to set, the mansion grew darker, the shadows in the corners lengthening like skeletal fingers. Emily was about to head upstairs to unpack when she noticed something strange on the floor near the staircase. She knelt down, brushing away the dust to reveal what looked like small circular burn marks etched into the wood. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. They weren't there when she first arrived. She was sure of it. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere. As she touched one of the marks, a sudden jolt of icy cold shot up her arm, making her gasp. The lights in the house flickered, and for a moment the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her ears with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. She clapped her hands over her ears, stumbling back against the wall, her mind reeling. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the voices stopped. The lights steadied, the house falling into a heavy, oppressive silence. Emily stood there, shaking, the air around her so cold she could see her breath. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she forced herself to move, heading upstairs to the relative safety of her bedroom. She needed to get some sleep, to clear her mind. This house was just playing tricks on her, she told herself. But as she lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She pulled the covers up to her chin, listening intently to the silence. And then, just as sleep began to pull her under, she heard it again, a soft whisper from the hallway. Emily. Her eyes shot open, her heart pounding furiously. She lay there, frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the whispering voices drew closer and closer to her door. The house was no longer content with being a passive observer. It wanted something from her, and it was only just begin. The morning light brought little comfort to Emily as she woke from a fitful sleep. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her limbs felt heavy as if she had run a marathon. She couldn't shake the memories of the whispers that had haunted her dreams, or were they dreams? The more she thought about it, the less certain she became. The strange voices had seemed so real, like ghostly breaths against her ear. Determined to get through the day, she forced herself out of bed and into the shower. The icy water helped to clear her mind, but even there she couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. The old house groaned and creaked, the pipes rattling as if in protest. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, filling her with an ever-growing sense of dread. After getting dressed, she made her way downstairs. The house was cold, despite the sun shining through the dusty windows. As she prepared a simple breakfast, her thoughts drifted to the locked door at the end of the west wing hallway. The whispers that had come from behind it the day before had not been her imagination. She knew that now. Something was behind that door, something that desperately wanted out. With her phone still refusing to connect to any network, Emily had no choice but to explore the mansion on her own. She couldn't ignore the door any longer. She needed to know what was inside, if only to put her mind at ease. After gulping down her coffee, she armed herself with a heavy flashlight and a crowbar she had found in the dusty garage. The hallway to the west wing felt colder than the rest of the house, as if the very air had been drained of warmth. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly, each step seeming to be followed by a faint, almost imperceptible shuffle behind her. She stopped several times, turning around, but there was nothing there, just shadows lurking in the corners, waiting. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her heart racing. The iron bands and thick wood gave it an ominous presence, as though it were not just a door, but a barrier meant to keep something locked away. The whispers had been silent since yesterday, but now, Standing before the door again, she could almost feel the vibrations of faint voices, like distant cries carried on the wind. Taking a deep breath, she jammed the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame. The wood creaked in protest as she applied pressure, beads of sweat forming on her brow despite the cold. After several long, agonizing moments, the ancient lock gave way with a loud, metallic snap. The door swung open with a creak, releasing a gust of stale, icy air that smelled of rot and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Emily hesitated on the threshold, her flashlight illuminating a narrow, pitch-black stairway leading down into darkness. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The locked door wasn't just a room, it was the entrance to a basement she hadn't known existed. Steeling herself, she began her descent, each step echoing hollowly in the confined space. The temperature dropped with every step, and soon she could see her breath puffing out in small white clouds. The walls were lined with damp, mold-covered stones, and strange symbols were scratched into the surface, their meaning lost to time. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, cavernous room, illuminated by the flickering beam of her flashlight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, making her gag. The stone floor was covered in strange markings, circles, lines, and runes that twisted and spiraled like a madman's scrawl. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained dark with something she prayed was not blood. A cold dread washed over her. This wasn't just some forgotten cellar or storage space, it was a ritual chamber. As she approached the altar, her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Her pulse quickened when she noticed something glinting on the floor near the altar. She knelt down and picked it up, realizing it was an old photograph, brittle with age. The image was faded, but she could still make out a group of people standing together, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. But it was the figure in the center that made her blood run cold. It was a woman who looked eerily like Emily herself, her eyes wide with terror, her hands bound behind her back. The resemblance was uncanny, as though she were staring at a ghostly reflection of herself from another time. Before she could process what she was seeing, a cold, skeletal hand clamped down on her shoulder. Emily screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there, only the thick, suffocating darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing around the chamber like a chorus of tormented souls. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with pain. The voices seemed to swirl around her, closing in like a pack of wolves. Her flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging her into total darkness. Panic gripped her, and she fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it to work. But it was no use. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, now accompanied by a faint, scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. In her panic, she stumbled backward, her hands reaching out to find something, anything, to hold on to. Her fingers brushed against cold, slick stone, and she realized she was backed up against the altar. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. Emily cried out, shielding her eyes. When the light faded, she was no longer alone. Figures began to materialize in the darkness, ghostly silhouettes that shimmered and wavered, like reflections on the surface of water. Their eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and their mouths moved soundlessly, their whispers now a maddening cacophony. One of the figures stepped forward, its translucent hand reaching for Emily. She tried to move, but her body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure's touch was like ice, seeping through her skin and into her very bones. "Free us!" the figure whispered, its voice a hoarse rasp that sent chills down her spine. "You must finish what he began." "What are you talking about?" Emily gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. But the figure did not answer. It only stared at her with its hollow eyes, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures began to fade, dissolving into the darkness like mist. The light in the room flickered back on, and Emily found herself alone once more. the whispers reduced to a faint murmur. She bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Slamming the door behind her, she locked it with trembling hands, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But as she backed away from the door, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were coming from inside her head now, a chorus of voices that grew louder and louder, drowning out her thoughts. "You cannot leave. You are bound to this place." Emily clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The house had woken up, and it had found its new victim. And it wasn't going to let her go. Emily spent the rest of the day holed up in the master bedroom, her back pressed against the heavy wooden door, as if that could keep whatever horrors lurked in the mansion's depths at bay. The whispers had finally faded, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence. She tried to rationalize what had happened in the basement. Maybe it was exhaustion, the stress of moving into this decrepit house. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. She glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the dusty corners and faded wallpaper. The once grand decor now looked like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream, decayed and rotting. Emily knew she couldn't hide forever, but she needed a way to make sense of it all. She needed answers. Determined to gather her bearings, she forced herself to move. She had to at least make the mansion feel like it could be a home again, even if it was a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. As she explored the rooms on the second floor, her heart began to settle into a steady rhythm. The daylight outside, though dim and hazy, seemed to give her a sliver of hope. That hope vanished when she entered one of the guest bedrooms at the far end of the hall. This room was filled with an assortment of old furniture, covered in dusty white sheets. As she pulled the sheets away, revealing antique dressers and side tables, she uncovered a tall, ornate mirror tucked away in the corner. It was beautifully carved, with intricate patterns of vines and roses that had faded with time. Despite its elegance, the mirror's glass was cloudy, almost opaque, as if it had been hiding secrets for far too long. Emily felt an inexplicable pull towards the mirror. She wiped her sleeve across its surface, clearing away the thick layer of grime. As she gazed into her own reflection, she shuddered. Her face looked pale and haggard, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. She barely recognized herself, but it was more than just her tired appearance that sent a chill down her spine. The reflection seemed off. The room behind her in the mirror was subtly different, darker, the shadows deeper. And then she saw it, a figure standing behind her. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its features obscured, but she could make out its eyes, two hollow black pits that stared unblinkingly at her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the air. Turning back to the mirror, the figure was gone. Her reflection was normal again, just her own frightened face staring back at her. She told herself it was just her imagination, the lingering effects of whatever nightmare she had uncovered in the basement. But as she stepped away from the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her through the glass, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That night, as darkness fell over the mansion, the wind howled through the trees outside, making the house creak and groan like a living thing. Emily tried to distract herself by organizing her belongings, but her eyes kept drifting back to the mirror in the corner. It seemed to draw her attention no matter where she was in the room, its presence like a black hole, swallowing the light. Eventually, exhaustion forced her to collapse into bed. But as she drifted off, she had the unsettling feeling that she wasn't alone. Her dreams were filled with fragmented images, a woman's face twisted in agony, the sound of distant screaming, and the sensation of cold hands gripping her wrists. Emily woke with a start in the dead of night, her heart racing. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the window. She lay there, listening to the silence, when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the mirror. Terrified but unable to stop herself, she turned on the bedside lamp and slowly approached the mirror. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, like fingers drumming against the glass. As she got closer, she noticed something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. The reflection wasn't just showing her room anymore. The glass had turned a murky shade of black, and within it, she could see what appeared to be a different room entirely. An old, decrepit space with walls covered in what looked like peeling wallpaper and mold. The tapping grew louder, more desperate, like someone trapped on the other side trying to break through. And then, through the darkened glass, she saw it again, the figure with hollow eyes. This time it was clearer, more defined. It was no longer just a shadow, but a grotesque, emaciated figure, its face twisted into an expression of rage and desperation. Its bony fingers scratched at the other side of the glass, trying to break free. "Help me!" the figure hissed, its voice muffled as if it were coming from the depths of a well. Emily stumbled back, knocking over a side table in her panic. The mirror rattled but did not shatter. Instead, the figure pressed its skeletal face against the glass, its black eyes widening with something that looked like hunger. "Help me, Emily," it whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't muffled. It was clear, sharp, and it sounded disturbingly like her own. In a blind panic, she grabbed the dusty sheet she had taken off the mirror earlier and threw it over the glass, cutting off her view of the horrible apparition. The whisper stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The tapping ceased, but she could still hear the faint sound of breathing, as though someone or something was standing right behind the mirror, waiting. For the rest of the night, Emily huddled in the farthest corner of her bed, clutching a flashlight in her trembling hands. She kept her eyes fixed on the covered mirror, half expecting the sheet to be ripped away at any moment by whatever monstrous thing was trapped behind the glass. When dawn finally broke, Emily was no closer to understanding what was happening. But one thing was clear. The house wasn't just haunted by echoes of the past. It was alive, and it had begun to take a particular interest in her. As the sun rose, casting weak light into her room, Emily dared to approach the covered mirror. Her hands trembled as she slowly pulled the sheet away, expecting the worst. But when the mirror came into view, all she saw was her own reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. Trying to convince herself it was over, that it was just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, she turned away. But as she left the room, she couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the mirror, her reflection was still staring at her, but it didn't move. It just stood there, grinning. And behind it, in the depths of the darkened glass, the hollow-eyed figure was still there, waiting. The morning light did little to dispel the dread that clung to Emily like a second skin. Her dreams had been a tangled mess of shadows and whispered voices, leaving her more exhausted than when she had gone to bed. Every sound in the old mansion, the creaking of floorboards, the groaning pipes, seemed amplified, making her flinch at the slightest noise. She had managed to cover the mirror in her bedroom once more, but the memory of that leering grin and the hollow-eyed figure stayed with her, gnawing at her sanity. Emily knew she had to get to the bottom of whatever was happening in this house, or she would lose her mind. After the terrifying events of the previous night, she decided to search the mansion for anything that might explain what was happening. There had to be a reason her parents had kept this place hidden, something buried in its walls that they had been too afraid to speak of. With a grim determination, Emily made her way to the attic, the one place she had yet to explore thoroughly. The attic door groaned loudly as she pushed it open, a blast of cold, musty air hitting her in the face. The narrow wooden staircase creaked under her weight as she ascended into the darkness above. The attic was a cavernous space, filled with old furniture, broken lamps, and trunks covered in a thick layer of dust. The only light came from a small, grimy window that let in a dim, grayish light, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. As Emily picked her way through the clutter, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. At the far end of the attic, tucked beneath a pile of old newspapers, she found an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and brittle, the leather peeling away in places. There were no markings to indicate who it had belonged to, but as she opened it, a musty smell of age and decay filled her nostrils. The handwriting inside was erratic, the ink faded to a rusty brown, as if the pages had absorbed the writer's desperation. The entries were dated nearly a century ago, and as Emily flipped through the pages, she quickly realized this journal had belonged to Victor Holloway, the original owner of the mansion. August 17, 1923. The voices have returned, louder now, insistent. They call my name in the dead of night, urging me to complete the ritual, but I am too weak. The house demands more than I can give. Emily's heart raced as she read the words. They echoed her own experiences, the whispers that seemed to follow her through the house, growing louder and more urgent with each passing day. September 3rd, 1923. The children's laughter haunts me. I see them in the corners of my vision, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted with glee. They are not children anymore, but shadows of what they once were. I have made a grave mistake. Emily shivered. The mention of children's laughter sent a chill through her. She had heard those faint giggles herself, echoing through the halls at night. She turned the page, her hands shaking as she read on. October 9th, 1923. I have tried to resist, but the house has taken hold of me. It demands sacrificed blood to keep it satisfied. I have no choice. Tonight, I will do what must be done to keep the voices at bay, if only for a short while. God forgive me. Her blood ran cold. The basement room she had discovered flashed in her mind, the strange markings, the blood stains on the altar. Had Victor conducted some kind of ritual there? The journal seemed to confirm her worst fears. Whatever haunted this house had been awakened by rituals performed in desperation. And now, it was trying to ensnare her. The next entry was short and written in a shaky hand, as if Victor had been writing in a state of panic. October 31st, 1923. I can hear them outside my door. They are coming for me. The shadows, they are alive. They whisper my sins, and I cannot escape. I am theirs now, bound to this cursed place for eternity. To whoever finds this, do not trust the house. It will consume you as it has consumed me. Burn it, destroy it before it is too late. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She snapped the journal shut, her mind racing. Burn the house? Was that truly the only way to stop whatever malevolent force was trapped here? But the thought of setting the place ablaze filled her with a deep, inexplicable dread, as if the house itself were warning her against it. Clutching the journal to her chest, she made her way back downstairs. The air in the mansion felt heavier now, charged with a malevolent energy. She could feel it pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that seemed to seep into her very bones. The house was waking up, and it knew she was getting closer to its secrets. As she reached the ground floor, she heard it again, children's laughter, faint but distinct. The sound sent a chill down her spine. It was coming from the direction of the grand library she had explored earlier. Steeling herself, Emily made her way toward the source of the laughter. The library was dark, the heavy drapes blocking out what little light remained from the dying afternoon sun. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rows of dusty bookshelves. The laughter stopped abruptly as she entered the room, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from the far corner of the library, where the bookshelves were densely packed with ancient tomes. She moved toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. There, on a low shelf, she noticed a book that seemed out of place. Unlike the others, its spine was pristine, as if it had been untouched by time. She pulled it from the shelf, and as she did, a hidden compartment behind the bookcase clicked open with a soft hiss. Inside the compartment, she found a bundle of yellowed papers tied together with a black ribbon. They appeared to be letters, all addressed to Victor Holloway. But as she unfolded one, she realized they were not letters of correspondence, but rather desperate pleas. Please, Victor, stop whatever you are doing. The house is alive. I can hear it calling for me at night. The others are gone, taken by the shadows. I fear I am next. God save us all. Emily's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the letters. The house had driven its previous occupants to madness, trapping them in a cycle of fear and despair. And now it had set its sights on her. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from directly behind her. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. There, in the corner, stood a figure she recognized all too well, her own reflection from the mirror, grinning that same horrible grin. It was no longer confined to the glass, it was here, in the flesh. The figure's eyes were black pits, voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. Its grin widened impossibly, splitting its face in half. "Welcome home, Emily," it said in her voice, the sound twisted and mocking. "You cannot escape. You are bound to us now." Emily stumbled back, the journal slipping from her hands. The letters scattered across the floor as she turned and fled, the figure's laughter echoing behind her. As she sprinted through the dark hallways of the mansion, the whispers swelled into a deafening roar. The house was alive, and it had her firmly in its grasp. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Somewhere in this cursed house was the answer she needed. She had to find it before the house claimed her soul, just as it had claimed so many others before her. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging Hollow Ridge into darkness once again. Emily stood in the foyer, her back against the cold, unyielding door, trying to steady her breath. She had run through the labyrinthine halls of the mansion, pursued by something that wore her face, that spoke in her voice. The echoes of its laughter still lingered in her mind, sending chills down her spine. With trembling hands, she slid the deadbolt into place, not that she believed it would keep the horrors of this house at bay. The mansion was no ordinary structure. It was alive, breathing, its very walls pulsing with a dark, sinister energy that she could almost feel under her skin. She had to think. She needed a plan. Victor Holloway's journal had made one thing clear. Whatever evil had taken root here had grown stronger through years of blood sacrifices and twisted rituals. But the entries were cryptic, hinting at something more ancient, something that predated even the mansion itself. Emily needed more answers if she had any hope of escaping this nightmare. Forcing herself to move, she headed toward the library. It seemed to be the epicenter of the house's strange energy, a place where the veil between reality and whatever dark realm the house was connected to felt thinnest. As she made her way down the dimly lit corridor, she could hear faint whispers and the soft creaking of floorboards beneath her feet. It was as if the mansion was reacting to her presence, growing agitated by her defiance. The library door creaked open, revealing rows of towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch into darkness. The smell of old leather, dust, and something far more acrid filled the air. Emily approached the hidden compartment where she had found Victor's letters earlier, hoping she had missed something, anything that could provide a clue. As she rifled through the scattered papers, the air around her grew colder, the temperature plummeting so rapidly that her breath formed in white puffs before her face. She froze, her eyes darting toward the far corner of the room. There, half shrouded in shadow, was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, its limbs too long and gangly to be human. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, like the figure she had seen in the mirror, but this one felt more real, more solid. It watched her with an unnatural stillness, the kind that only something inhuman could possess. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to back away, but the figure moved with a sudden, jerky motion, crossing the room in a series of unnatural, disjointed steps. The air grew heavy, pressing in on her lungs like an invisible weight. She stumbled, reaching blindly for something, anything that could serve as a weapon. Her fingers closed around an ornate letter opener lying on the desk. As the creature lunged, she swung wildly, the blade passing through it as if it were made of smoke. The wraith-like figure let out a guttural hiss, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You cannot escape us," it rasped, its voice like the sound of dry leaves scraping across stone. "You belong to the house now." Emily's mind raced. She had to get away, but where could she go? The house was a maze, each corridor seeming to twist and shift, leading her deeper into its clutches. She turned and sprinted toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it, trapping her inside the library with the creature. Desperate, she darted behind one of the massive bookshelves, her mind racing through everything she had read in Victor's journal. There had to be something she could use. Then she remembered. One of the entries had mentioned symbols of protection, wards that could hold back the shadows. She just needed to find them. The wraith prowled through the library, its rasping breath filling the air as it searched for her. Emily's hands shook as she frantically pulled books from the shelves, tossing them aside. Finally she found it, a thick, dusty tome filled with arcane symbols. The pages were brittle and smelled of decay, but she flipped through them feverishly, searching for the symbol Victor had drawn. Outside the library, a violent storm had begun. The wind howled through the broken windows, rain lashing against the walls like a torrent of angry whispers. The house groaned in response, its very foundations seeming to tremble with the force of the storm. The creature drew closer, its dark form slithering between the shelves like a serpent. Emily's eyes fell on a page depicting a protective sigil, accompanied by a rushed scrawl in Victor's handwriting. "Inscribe this on the ground with salt. It will hold the darkness at bay, but only for a time." Without wasting a second, she dug into her pockets, praying she still had the small vial of salt she had grabbed from the kitchen earlier. Her fingers closed around it, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The wraith was nearly upon her, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Emily poured the salt in a shaky circle around herself, her hands trembling as she traced the symbol from the book onto the ground. The moment the circle was complete, the air around her seemed to shimmer. The wraith let out an ear-piercing scream, recoiling as if it had been struck. Its form flickered, becoming less solid, like a shadow losing its substance. The creature raged, clawing at the invisible barrier, but it couldn't penetrate the circle. Emily stood in the center, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm outside. For a moment, she thought she was safe. But then, the whispers returned, louder than before, as if the house itself was furious. The books on the shelves began to shake, some flying off and crashing to the ground. The walls seemed to pulse, the ancient wood groaning as if something was trying to break free. Emily's relief was short-lived. The wraith outside the circle was no longer alone. Dark shapes began to coalesce in the shadows, more figures, their hollow eyes staring hungrily at her. The protective circle trembled as the wraiths pressed against it, their whispers blending into a cacophony of madness. "You cannot keep us out forever," one of them hissed. "We are bound to this place, as are you." Emily's mind raced. The circle was weakening, the salt line dissolving under the relentless onslaught. She needed a way out, but the only exit was blocked by the wraiths. Her eyes darted to the book in her hands, hoping for a clue, a spell, anything that could buy her more time. Then she saw it, a passage scrawled hastily in the margins, almost illegible. "The house is a prison, a gateway. It feeds on fear, on despair. The mirror is the key. Break it, and you sever the bond." The mirror, the cursed thing in her bedroom, that was the link holding this nightmare together. If she could destroy it, maybe she could stop the house from consuming her. But getting there was another matter entirely. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Emily took a deep breath and made a decision. The circle wouldn't hold for much longer. She had to make a run for it. She kicked through the weakening salt barrier and sprinted toward the door, the wraiths shrieking in fury as they lunged after her. The storm outside intensified, the wind battering the house like a wild animal trying to tear it apart. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she raced down the hallway, dodging grasping shadows that clawed at her from the walls. She reached the staircase, practically throwing herself up the steps 2 at a time. The whispers grew louder, screaming now, as if the house itself were furious that she was slipping through its grasp. The moment she reached her bedroom door, she slammed into it, forcing it open. The mirror stood in the corner, covered by the sheet. Without hesitating, Emily ripped the cover off. Her reflection stared back at her, grinning that terrible grin. Behind her reflection, the hollow-eyed figure loomed, its skeletal hand reaching toward her. "Break it!" Emily screamed to herself, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a brass candlestick. She swung with all her strength, smashing the mirror into 1,000 shards. As the glass shattered, the air in the room exploded with a deafening scream, the sound so intense it made her ears bleed. The house shuddered, the walls cracking as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The wraith's shrieks turned to howls of agony as they dissolved into wisps of smoke. And then there was silence. Emily collapsed to her knees, surrounded by broken glass. The house had fallen eerily still. She took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face as she tried to process what had just happened. But as she looked at the shards of the shattered mirror, her heart sank. In each fragment, her reflection still stared back at her, grinning. The house wasn't done with her yet. Emily lay on the cold, hardwood floor of her bedroom, surrounded by the shards of the broken mirror, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The silence that had followed the shattering of the mirror was heavy and unnatural, as if the entire house were holding its breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that it was truly over, that destroying the mirror had severed whatever bond the house held over her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The fragments of glass scattered around her still reflected distorted, grinning images of herself, each one twisting and shifting as if alive. She scrambled to her feet, refusing to look at the shards for more than a moment, afraid of what she might see. The oppressive atmosphere in the house seemed to ease ever so slightly, as if it were regrouping, waiting for its next move. She didn't have much time. She needed to figure out what was happening, and quickly. Victor's journal had hinted that the mansion thrived on fear and despair, that it was a prison for souls, but she still didn't understand how or why. As she stood there trying to collect her thoughts, she heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of children's laughter, echoing through the hallways like the soft tinkling of bells. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct, like a chorus of giggles coming from every direction. Emily's blood ran cold. She had heard that laughter before in the dark corridors in her dreams, but now it was everywhere. She turned in circles, her eyes darting to the door, the windows, the shadows in the corners of the room. But there was no one there, just the echoing sound of unseen children playing, giggling, whispering her name. "Emily, come play with us, come find us." Her heart pounded as the voices grew louder, more insistent, like the taunting chants of school children on a playground. The sound was coming from downstairs, drifting up from the foyer like a siren's call. She knew she should stay put, barricade herself in her room, and wait for daylight, but something inside her urged her to follow. The children's voices seemed to carry a different tone, now not just playful, but pleading, desperate. There was something heartbreaking in the way they called out to her, their voices layered with an underlying sorrow. "Help us, please." Emily's resolve crumbled. Whatever haunted this house was tormenting the souls of children, and she couldn't just ignore it. Gathering her courage, she grabbed her flashlight, her hands shaking as she tightened her grip. She slowly made her way out of the bedroom and down the hallway, her footsteps almost silent on the threadbare carpet. The mansion was pitch black, the storm outside having swallowed the moonlight entirely. The only light came from the beam of her flashlight, which seemed to barely penetrate the darkness. As she descended the grand staircase, the laughter grew louder, filling the vast, cavernous space of the foyer. She paused at the base of the stairs, turning in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the voices. The house seemed to pulse around her, the very walls vibrating with energy. The laughter shifted, growing softer, more distant, as if the children were leading her deeper into the mansion. They were drawing her toward the west wing, the part of the house that she had come to dread the most. It was where the locked door had led to the ritual chamber beneath the mansion, where she had first encountered the horrors that seemed to be stalking her. But now, it seemed the children wanted her to go even further. "Down here, Emily, this way, help us." The voices were coming from behind another door she had never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, tucked away at the far end of the west wing corridor. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one looked newer, its wood unmarked by time. A chill ran down her spine as she approached it, the children's voices growing softer, more urgent. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. It turned easily, the door swinging open without a sound, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. A blast of cold, stale air hit her, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Emily hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run. But the children's voices called to her, soft and pleading, tugging at her heart. "Please, Emily, don't leave us. We need you." Taking a deep breath, she began her descent. The stairs were narrow, winding, and seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. Her flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and ragged, and the faint sound of footsteps that weren't her own, echoing just behind her. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a low, vaulted room. The stone walls were covered in damp patches, the floor slick with moisture. But what drew her attention was the series of small doors lining the far wall, each one barely large enough for a child to crawl through. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a chorus of soft, rhythmic sobs. Emily approached the doors cautiously, her flashlight beam trembling. She knelt down and peered into one of the openings, her heart breaking at what she saw. Inside was the huddled form of a child, its face buried in its hands, its shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent, its hair a tangled mess of dark strands. Hey, it's okay," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here to help you." The child slowly raised its head, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to suck in the light. Its mouth twisted into a grin that split its face, showing rows of needle-like teeth. "Play with us," it whispered in a voice that was not a child's but a harsh, guttural rasp. Emily stumbled back, horror clawing at her throat, as the other small doors creaked open, revealing more of the pale, hollow-eyed children crawling out, their movements jerky and unnatural. They swarmed toward her, their laughter turning into a chorus of shrill, mocking screams. Desperate, she backed away, but the children moved faster, their skeletal hands reaching for her. She swung her flashlight like a weapon, but it passed through them as if they were made of smoke. Their laughter filled her ears, growing louder and louder until it became a deafening roar. Just as the first set of icy hands closed around her ankles, something inside her snapped. With a scream, she tore free and ran, not daring to look back. She bolted up the staircase, her feet slipping on the damp stone, the children's laughter following her like a taunting echo. She burst into the hallway, slamming the door behind her. The house seemed to shake in fury, the walls vibrating as if they were about to collapse. But the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Emily leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The whispers, the children's laughter, the dark figures, they were all pieces of a puzzle she still didn't understand. But one thing was clear. The house had not let her in by accident. It wanted her here for a reason. And whatever that reason was, she was running out of time to figure it out. As she turned to head back toward the safety of her bedroom, she heard it. A new voice, soft and clear, coming from somewhere deep within the house. "Emily, you're getting closer." The game had changed. The house was no longer content with just scaring her. It was drawing her deeper into its web, setting the stage for the final act. Emily's hands were still shaking as she hurried back to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She could still hear the echoes of the children's twisted laughter reverberating through the mansion, as if the walls themselves were taunting her. Leaning against the door, she struggled to catch her breath. How much more of this could she take? How much longer before the house finally broke her? She glanced around her room, taking in the splintered remnants of the mirror she had smashed. The shards still reflected twisted versions of herself, their grins mocking her terror. She turned her back on them, trying to focus on the journal she had snatched up from the library in her panicked flight. Somewhere within its brittle pages had to be a clue, something that could help her unravel the malevolent grip the house had on her. Flipping through the journal, she came across a passage she hadn't noticed before. The handwriting was even more frenzied, the ink smeared as if Victor Holloway's hand had been shaking violently as he wrote it. The house's power is not confined to these walls. The forest behind the mansion, is alive with its darkness. The well, it all began with the well. They say it reaches deep into the earth, to a place where the darkness sleeps, waiting. But it is awake now. God help anyone who ventures there. Emily's pulse quickened. The forest, the well. The journal hinted that it was somehow the source of the house's power, the place where all the madness had begun. She remembered seeing it during her first day here, a forgotten structure hidden deep in the woods behind the mansion, choked with vines and brambles. At the time, she had dismissed it as just another relic of the past, but now it seemed the well held the answers she desperately needed. Grabbing her flashlight, a thick jacket, and the crowbar she had used to break into the locked basement door, Emily steeled herself. The thought of venturing into the dark forest at night made her stomach twist with dread, but she knew she couldn't afford to wait until morning. The house was growing more aggressive with each passing hour, and whatever force was awakening inside it was getting stronger. She slipped out of her room, moving as quietly as possible. The mansion groaned around her, the sound like a deep, mournful sigh. The air was thick with tension, as if the house were aware of her intentions and was preparing to stop her. The front door opened with a reluctant creak, and Emily stepped outside, greeted by the cold embrace of the night. The wind whipped around her, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the forest in an inky darkness. The beam of her flashlight barely pierced through the mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. She followed the overgrown path behind the mansion, her heart pounding louder than the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. The forest loomed around her, trees twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for her with skeletal branches. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made her flinch. Her nerves stretched taut. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, she reached the clearing where the old well stood. The structure was ancient, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. It was taller than she remembered, as if it had grown in the time since she had first seen it. The air around it was colder, the ground frozen despite the dampness of the earth elsewhere in the forest. Emily approached the well cautiously, shining her flashlight down into its depths. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, revealing nothing but an abyss that went on forever. She could hear a faint sound drifting up from below, like a chorus of whispers carried on a breeze that did not belong to this world. As she leaned closer, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, layered on top of one another, pleading, crying, and sometimes laughing hysterically. "Emily, come closer, join us." Her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if something were draining its power. She gripped it tighter, her knuckles white. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, she knelt by the edge of the well and peered into the darkness. Suddenly, a pair of skeletal hands shot up from the depths, grasping her wrists with an icy grip. Emily screamed, trying to pull away, but the hands held fast, their touch so cold it burned. The whispers turned into shrieks of laughter, the voices echoing up from the abyss, drowning out her cries. The hands began to pull, dragging her toward the edge of the well. She scrambled for footing, her boots slipping on the slick stones. In her panic, she swung the crowbar wildly, managing to strike one of the hands. It shattered into dust, releasing its grip, but the other hand held firm. Desperation clawed at her mind. She could feel herself being pulled toward the darkness below, an abyss that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The well was alive, feeding on her fear, trying to drag her into whatever hellish pit lay beneath the earth. In a last, desperate effort, Emily reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a vial of salt she had kept since her encounter in the library. She poured it directly onto the hand clutching her wrist. The effect was immediate. The skeletal hand let out a shriek, releasing her as it disintegrated into black smoke. Panting, Emily stumbled back from the well, her heart racing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, angry rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath her trembled, cracks spreading outward from the base of the well. She watched in horror as the stones began to crumble, the entire structure collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. As the dust settled, Emily could see that the well was now completely sealed, buried under a pile of rubble. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight that had been pressing on her chest easing ever so slightly. But the relief was short-lived. From behind her, deeper in the forest, came the sound of branches snapping, the rustle of leaves. Something was coming. The house might have lost its grip on the well, but whatever force she had awakened was not done with her yet. Emily turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted back toward the mansion. The air behind her was filled with the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with each passing second. She didn't dare look back. The house came into view, its dark silhouette outlined against the stormy sky. She could see the lights in the windows flickering like the dying embers of a fire. Whatever she had done by disturbing the well had angered the house, and it was preparing to unleash its full fury on her. Bursting through the front door, she slammed it shut, the echo reverberating through the mansion. The entire house seemed to groan in protest, as if it were trying to expel her. The whispers returned, louder now, filling every corner of the room. "You cannot escape us, Emily. The house will have you." Exhausted and terrified, Emily knew she had only one option left. She had to find the source of the house's power and destroy it once and for all. Whatever lay at the heart of this nightmare was still hidden somewhere within the twisted halls of the mansion. And now, she was running out of time. The game had changed. The house was no longer playing tricks, it was fighting back, and it was determined to drag her down into darkness. But Emily was no longer just a victim. She was ready to fight back. The mansion was in chaos. The air thrummed with a feverish energy, like a beast that had been wounded and was now lashing out in its death throes. The walls trembled, and the lights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced like phantoms across the cracked, decaying wallpaper. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears as she raced through the twisting corridors, the voices of the house whispering, cajoling, threatening her at every turn. She had barely made it back inside after fleeing the well, but she knew she couldn't rest yet. Whatever she had done out there had only enraged the house further. The oppressive presence she had felt since her first night here was no longer content with simply toying with her. It was coming for her with a vengeance. "Find the heart," she whispered to herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I have to find the heart." Victor Holloway's journal had hinted at it, something deep within the mansion that acted as the source of its malevolent power. Destroy the heart, sever the connection, and maybe, just maybe, she could escape this nightmare alive. As she made her way deeper into the house, the air grew colder, the whispers louder. They seemed to come from all directions now, not just from the walls, but from the very floor beneath her feet. The house was trying to confuse her, turning corridors into dead ends, shifting the layout in subtle, maddening ways. She had to focus, had to keep moving forward. Then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, she found herself standing in front of a door she had desperately hoped never to see again. The door to the locked room she had broken into before, the one that led to the underground ritual chamber. The door, once closed and sealed tight, now stood slightly ajar, as if beckoning her to enter. A cold dread settled over her. She didn't want to go back down there, but she knew she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and descended the narrow staircase, the damp, moldy air wrapping around her like a shroud. The ritual chamber was just as she remembered it, the stone altar at the center, surrounded by strange arcane symbols carved into the floor, the air thick with the metallic stench of old blood. But now there was something new. Candles flickered on the edges of the room, casting an eerie glow, their flames swaying unnaturally as if caught in a non-existent breeze. As she stepped into the room, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that sent chills racing down her spine. "Emily, you've come at last." The voice was rich, commanding, and terrifyingly familiar. It was a voice she had heard before, in the whispers that haunted her dreams, in the mocking taunts of the house. Turning slowly, Emily's flashlight fell upon a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the chamber. Victor Holloway. He was no longer the desperate, half-mad figure she had imagined from his journal entries. Instead, he stood tall, his gaunt frame cloaked in dark robes, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His face was twisted in a grotesque grin, as if he were both pleased and amused by her presence. "You've been quite the troublesome guest, haven't you?" he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "Running through my house, defiling my well. It's been a long time since someone gave me such sport." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice wavering. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" Victor's grin widened, his hollow eyes gleaming like twin black stars. "This house is more than just wood and stone, my dear," he replied. "It is a gateway, a conduit to the darkness beyond, a darkness that I brought forth, that I nurtured, that I fed." Emily's mind raced. "The well," she whispered. You summoned something from it, didn't you?" Victor's eyes flickered, and for a moment his grin faltered. "Ah, you are clever," he said softly. "Yes, the well was the beginning. I thought I could control it, use its power to extend my life, to bind myself to this place. But the darkness was hungrier than I anticipated." Emily took a step back, her mind reeling. "So you sacrificed the children," she said, the horror of it sinking in. "You fed them to whatever was down there." A dark laugh escaped Victor's lips, the sound like the crackling of dry leaves. "Not just the children," he said, his grin widening. "Anyone who entered this house became fuel for the darkness, their fear, their despair. It was delicious." Emily's stomach churned. "But why me?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" Victor's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You have something the others did not," he said slowly, his voice now a low, menacing whisper. "You are bound to this house, Emily, just as I am. Your bloodline, it ties you here." "What are you talking about?" Emily asked, her heart skipping a beat. Victor stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a living thing. "Your family has always been connected to Hollow Ridge," he said. "Your ancestors helped me build this place, helped me open the gateway, but they betrayed me, tried to seal the darkness away." He spat the last words with venom. "You are the last of their line, Emily. The key to completing the ritual. The house needs you." Panic surged through her. All this time she had been trying to escape, to survive, but now it seemed the house had been waiting for her all along. She was the final piece of its puzzle. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't be a part of this." Victor's grin twisted into a snarl. "You don't have a choice, child," he hissed. "The house will have you. You are already bound to it. The moment you stepped through that door, it claimed you." As he spoke, the floor beneath Emily's feet began to vibrate, the symbols on the ground glowing with a sickly green light. The air around her thickened, becoming almost solid, as if the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. She could feel it now, the dark tendrils of the mansion's influence seeping into her mind, trying to drag her down into its depths. "No," she screamed, fighting against the invisible force. "I won't let you have me." Desperate, she remembered the salt she had used to fend off the wraiths. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the last remnants she had left. In a swift motion, she scattered the salt across the glowing symbols on the floor. Victor screamed, his voice a tortured wail that reverberated through the chamber. The light in his eyes flickered, and the ground beneath Emily's feet began to crack and splinter. The mansion shook violently, the walls groaning as if they were in agony. "You fool!" Victor howled, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You've only angered it. The house will consume us both." But Emily wasn't listening. She was already running, her legs burning as she sprinted back up the narrow staircase. The house shook around her, the whispers turning into a deafening roar. The walls seemed to close in, twisting and warping, trying to trap her. Bursting into the hallway, she stumbled, the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had to get to the heart, wherever it was, and destroy it before the house swallowed her alive. Victor's voice echoed in her mind, a final, taunting whisper. "You can't escape, Emily. You were never meant to leave. The house will not let you go." But Emily was done running. She had one chance left, and she would either destroy the heart of this cursed mansion or die trying. And with that resolve, she ran deeper into the darkness, ready to confront whatever horror awaited her. Emily's heart pounded as she sprinted through the darkened corridors of Hollow Ridge Mansion. The house was in chaos, the walls warped and trembled, the floor beneath her feet buckling as if the very structure were trying to swallow her whole. Victor's voice echoed in her mind, mocking her, taunting her with promises of inescapable doom. But she pushed those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to panic now, she was so close. The journal had mentioned a heart, a source of power, buried deep within the mansion. If she could destroy it, she might finally break free of this nightmare. But where was it? The house was shifting around her, turning into a maddening labyrinth, doors opening into rooms that hadn't been there before, hallways that twisted back on themselves like a serpent eating its tail. The whispers had grown louder, more aggressive. They filled her ears with a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some screaming, and others laughing with a sinister glee. It was as if the souls trapped within these walls were fighting to break free, their fury adding to the house's frenzied energy. Emily had no choice but to trust her instincts. She let her feet carry her through the twisting corridors, down flights of stairs that seemed to spiral endlessly into the earth. The deeper she went, the more the air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay and rot. The flickering light of her flashlight barely penetrated the suffocating darkness, the beam casting wild, jittery shadows that seemed to dance mockingly at the edge of her vision. As she reached the lowest level of the mansion, the floor beneath her suddenly gave way, sending her crashing through rotting wood into a hidden room below. She landed hard, pain jolting through her side. Dazed, she struggled to her feet, her flashlight miraculously still intact. She found herself in a cavernous chamber far below the house. This was something she hadn't seen on any of the blueprints or floor plans. The room was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows, the walls lined with ancient stone covered in strange, glowing symbols. And at the far end of the room, she saw it, a massive stone altar surrounded by a ring of dark, pulsating energy. The heart of the house. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The altar was covered in dried blood, the dark stains creeping like veins across its surface. Strange artifacts littered the area, ritual knives, rotting bones, and tattered robes that looked centuries old. But it was the object on top of the altar that caught her eye. A large, blackened book, its pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen wind. Emily's instincts screamed at her to stay away, but she knew this was it. The book seemed to throb with a dark energy, the same malevolence that she had felt throughout the mansion. It was the source of the whispers, the madness, and the house's unholy power. If she could destroy it, she might finally end this nightmare. As she reached for the book, a blast of cold air hit her, sending her stumbling back. The darkness at the edges of the room seemed to coalesce, forming into a familiar, twisted shape. Victor Holloway materialized before her, his gaunt figure wreathed in shadows, his eyes blazing with rage. "You think you can destroy what has been bound for centuries?" he snarled, his voice a thunderous roar that reverberated through the chamber. "You are nothing, Emily. You cannot break the pact." Emily's hands trembled, but she held her ground. "The house doesn't control me," she shot back, "and neither do you. I'm ending this." Victor's laugh was a chilling, hollow sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Oh, but you are already bound to it, child," he hissed. "You, like me, are now a part of this place. You can't destroy what you are tied to." Emily's mind raced. She remembered Victor's journal entries, the cryptic references to rituals, blood sacrifices, and dark bargains. It dawned on her then the house didn't just feed on the souls of its victims. It bound them, turning them into guardians, wraiths like Victor, forever cursed to serve the darkness. But there had to be a way to sever that bond, a way to end this curse once and for all. Steeling herself, Emily darted toward the altar, her fingers closing around the ancient book. The moment she touched it, a shock wave of energy surged through her, nearly knocking her off her feet. The voices in her head grew deafening, a storm of screams and whispers that threatened to drive her mad. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus. "The book is the key," she whispered to herself. "Destroy it, and the house loses its power." But Victor was not about to let her destroy the heart so easily. With an inhuman snarl, he lunged toward her, his hands transforming into grotesque claws. Emily barely managed to dodge his attack, stumbling to the side as his claws raked through the air where her head had been moments before. Desperate, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the last of the salt. With a quick, sweeping motion, she cast it in a circle around herself. Victor recoiled, hissing in fury as the salt formed a protective barrier. But she knew it wouldn't last long. She had to act fast. Emily flipped open the book, her eyes scanning the pages. The words were written in a language she couldn't understand, the symbols writhing on the page as if they were alive. But one thing was clear. The book was filled with rituals, dark invocations that bound souls to the house. At the center of it all was a single incantation, marked with a blood-red seal. The binding ritual. Emily realized then what she had to do. The house's power was tied to this incantation, to the pact that Victor had made all those years ago. If she could reverse it, she could sever the connection between the house and the darkness that fed it. Taking a deep breath, she began to read the words aloud, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each syllable. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the house groaning in protest. Victor howled in rage, his form flickering as the words seemed to burn him from the inside out. "No!" he screamed, lunging at her again. "You cannot undo what I have created." Emily ignored him, her voice rising as she chanted the final words. The symbols on the floor flared with a blinding light, and a wave of force exploded outward from the altar, sending Victor crashing into the far wall. The darkness that had filled the chamber seemed to convulse, the shadows writhing and twisting as if in agony. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and for a moment Emily thought she would be torn apart by the sheer force of it. But then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The light faded, the voices fell silent, and the oppressive energy that had filled the house dissipated. Emily fell to her knees, gasping for breath, the book slipping from her trembling hands. Victor was gone. The shadows that had once been his form were now nothing more than a faint wisp of smoke, slowly dissolving into the air. The house around her was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. She had done it, but as she stood there, alone in the darkness, a cold realization washed over her. The house might have lost its power, but she was still inside, and now she was bound to it. The mansion's doors creaked open somewhere above her, a soft, almost welcoming sound. It wasn't over. The house had claimed her as its own, and it was waiting, Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed against the cold stone floor of the ritual chamber, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The blinding light from her incantation had dissipated, plunging the room into near-total darkness once more. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the mansion seemed to have lifted, just slightly. But as she sat there, the realization sank in. She had not destroyed the house's power. She had merely awakened it. The ground beneath her was cold and slick, covered in moisture that smelled faintly of rot. Her hands shook as she reached for the book she had used to perform the counter-ritual, but the pages had turned to ash. Whatever magic she had tapped into had consumed it entirely, leaving only a hollow, blackened cover behind. Emily tried to get to her feet, but her legs felt weak, like they were made of lead. The toll of the ritual, the battles, and the relentless psychological torment had left her drained. But she couldn't stay here. She needed to move, to get out of the house before it recovered from whatever she had done to it. Gathering what strength she had left, she staggered toward the narrow staircase that led back to the main floors of the mansion. Each step was a battle. Every inch felt like wading through thick, invisible mud that seemed to resist her progress. As she climbed, the whispers returned, soft, insidious, like a gentle breeze caressing her ear. "Emily, you belong to us. There is no escape." Ignoring the whispers, she forced herself up the stairs, emerging into the long, dark corridor of the west wing. But something had changed. The air was colder, and a thick, acrid mist clung to the ground, swirling around her feet like living tendrils. The walls, once cracked and covered in peeling wallpaper, now seemed to pulse and shift, as if they were made of flesh rather than stone. The house is alive. The realization struck her like a physical blow. By disrupting the ritual, she had awoken something deeper, something ancient that had been lying dormant, feeding on the souls Victor Holloway had sacrificed over the years. Now, it was fully aware of her presence, and it was angry. A sudden, sharp sound behind her made her spin around, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick mist. But it only revealed more darkness, the faint outline of the corridor stretching into infinity. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she tried to calm herself. She had to keep moving. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her now. But then she saw it, just at the edge of her vision. Shadows began to crawl along the walls. They moved slowly at first, like black ink spreading through water, but soon they gathered speed, converging on her from all directions. These were not the passive, silent shadows she had seen before. These were alive, hungry, reaching for her with elongated skeletal fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Panic surged through her as she turned and bolted down the corridor, the sound of the crawling shadows growing louder behind her. They skittered and scraped along the walls, the ceiling, the floor, like a swarm of insects closing in on their prey. The air was filled with a sickening, slithering sound that made her skin crawl. "Leave me alone," Emily screamed, her voice raw with terror. But the shadows only seemed to feed on her fear, growing thicker, darker, faster. She reached a fork in the hallway, her mind racing. She had no idea where she was anymore. The house had twisted its layout again, turning familiar corridors into an endless maze. But there was no time to think. She chose the left passage and ran, her legs burning with exhaustion. Suddenly, the floor beneath her buckled, and she stumbled, falling hard onto the cold, damp ground. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, rolling away and casting wild, erratic beams of light. Emily scrambled toward it, but the shadows surged forward, enveloping her legs in a freezing grip. They pulled at her, their touch like icy knives slicing into her skin. "No, no, no!" she screamed, kicking wildly, trying to free herself. But the shadows were relentless, their skeletal fingers digging into her flesh, pulling her back toward the darkness. In her panic, she remembered the salt she still had left. Fumbling with shaking hands, she reached into her pocket and scattered a handful of it onto the shadows clinging to her. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled with a collective shriek, releasing their grip on her. Emily scrambled to her feet, grabbing her flashlight just as the beam began to flicker. She could hear the shadows retreating, but they didn't go far. They hovered at the edges of the light, writhing and undulating, waiting for their chance to strike again. She had to find a place to hide, somewhere the shadows couldn't reach her. But where? The entire house was infested with them, the walls themselves oozing darkness like blood from a wound. As she ran, she spotted a door at the end of the hallway that she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Without thinking, Emily lunged for the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind her. The shadows hissed angrily, but they didn't follow. For a moment, there was silence. The room she had entered was small and cluttered, filled with dusty old furniture and stacks of forgotten books. But in the center of the room was something that sent a chill down her spine, a large, ornate mirror, identical to the one she had shattered in her bedroom. "No, not another one," she whispered, backing away from the glass. But as she did, the surface of the mirror began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone, and from within its depths a familiar figure emerged. It was Victor Holloway, his form twisted and broken, his eyes glowing with a sickly green light, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, his face contorted with both rage and triumph. "You thought you could escape, Emily?" he taunted, his voice a low, malevolent growl. "The house owns you now. You are part of it, just as I am." Emily's heart pounded as she realized the truth. Destroying the book hadn't severed the house's connection to the darkness. It had only released Victor, allowing him to manifest fully within the mansion. Victor reached through the glass, his skeletal fingers elongating, reaching for her. In a desperate bid to protect herself, Emily grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table and swung it with all her strength. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying everywhere. But instead of dissipating, Victor's form began to seep from the broken glass, like black smoke pouring into the room. The shadows on the other side of the door began pounding against it, trying to break through. Emily was running out of options. Then she saw it, a symbol carved into the floor beneath the mirror, partially hidden by dust. It was the same protective sigil she had seen in Victor's journal, the one he had used to bind the darkness. In a flash of inspiration, she realized what she needed to do. She grabbed a piece of broken glass from the shattered mirror and, with trembling hands, traced the sigil into the floor with her own blood. As she completed the last line, the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. The shadows shrieked in agony, and Victor's form convulsed, torn between the physical world and whatever dark realm he had been bound to. Emily watched as his twisted figure was sucked back into the remnants of the mirror, his screams fading into the distance. And then there was silence. The door burst open, revealing the corridor beyond, now clear of the writhing shadows. The house seemed to sigh, its oppressive weight lifting, if only for a moment. But Emily knew it wasn't over. She had only bought herself a little more time. The house was still alive, still hungry, and she was still trapped within its grasp. She had found a way to weaken it, but the heart of the darkness remained hidden somewhere deep within the mansion. And now she was the only one left to find it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back into the dark corridors, ready to face whatever horrors awaited her next. Emily's steps echoed down the silent corridor as she moved deeper into the mansion. The oppressive darkness had eased somewhat, the shadows less aggressive after her encounter with Victor in the mirror. But she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The house was still alive, still aware, and it was only a matter of time before it came after her again. She checked her watch. 32 a.m. The hour felt significant, familiar in a way that sent a chill through her. She had woken up at exactly 3:33 a.m. multiple times since arriving at the mansion, always disoriented, always with a nagging sense that something terrible had occurred while she slept. Victor's journal had mentioned that time was malleable in the mansion, that the house could bend the very fabric of reality to trap its victims in an endless loop of fear. Emily turned a corner and found herself in front of a set of double doors she hadn't seen before. The doors were slightly ajar, a faint, sickly green light spilling through the gap. The air was cold, colder than any part of the mansion she had been in. She hesitated, but something in the back of her mind urged her forward. This was the heart of the darkness. She could feel it in her bones. Pushing the doors open, she stepped into a vast, circular room that seemed to defy logic. The walls curved upward into an impossibly high dome, the ceiling lost in shadows. In the center of the room was a large, ornate grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging slowly, methodically, like the heartbeat of the mansion. The clock face was cracked, its hands frozen at exactly 3:33 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. The missing hour. This was the place where time seemed to slip away, where the house ensnared its victims, stealing fragments of their lives. The room felt both ancient and timeless, as if it had existed before the mansion was even built. The floor was covered in intricate, glowing symbols, similar to those she had seen in the ritual chamber, but more complex, more malevolent. The air hummed with a low, vibrating energy that made her teeth ache. As she approached the clock, she noticed that the pendulum was not just swinging, it was glowing faintly, leaving a trail of greenish light in its wake. The whispers she had grown so used to hearing were absent, replaced by a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to resonate in her chest, aligning with her heartbeat. Emily reached out to touch the clock, but as soon as her fingers brushed against the cold wood, the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. She staggered back, shielding her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was no longer alone. Standing in the center of the room was Victor Holloway, his form more solid, more real than before. His eyes blazed with an unnatural light, his face twisted with a mixture of triumph and fury. "Welcome to the heart of it all, Emily," he said, his voice reverberating through the chamber like a choir of tormented souls. "You've come so far, but you are too late. The house is awake, and you are the final piece it needs." Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Victor's grin widened, his skeletal fingers twitching at his sides. "This mansion was never just a house," he said. "It is a vessel, a gateway between worlds. Every sacrifice, every soul it consumes, strengthens the bridge between our reality and the darkness beyond. But it needs one more thing to complete the ritual, one more soul bound to the house to open the gate fully." He pointed a claw-like finger at her. "You, Emily, you are the key, your bloodline, your connection to those who built this place. It all culminates with you. The house has been waiting for you." Emily's mind reeled. She had thought she was just another victim, another pawn in the mansion's cruel game. But now she understood. She wasn't here by accident. She had been drawn here, lured into a trap set generations ago. The house needed her to complete whatever dark ritual Victor had started long ago. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't be a part of this. I'm not going to let you use me." Victor's laughter was a hollow, mocking sound. "You think you have a choice? The house already has its hooks in you. Every time you lost that hour, every time you woke up disoriented, it was taking pieces of you, binding you to its will." As he spoke, the grandfather clock behind him began to chime, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber. Emily's head swam, the sound pulling at her mind, threatening to drag her into darkness. She staggered, clutching her head, fighting to stay conscious. "You see?" Victor hissed, stepping closer. "The house is pulling you in. By the time the clock strikes 3:33 again, it will have you completely." Emily's vision blurred, the room around her twisting and warping. She could feel something inside her unraveling, as if the mansion were peeling away layers of her mind, trying to reach the core of her being. She had to act fast, or she would be lost forever. Desperation surged through her. She remembered the symbols she had drawn in the ritual chamber, the protective wards that had saved her from the shadows. There had to be a way to use them here, to disrupt the connection between the house and its source of power. With a sudden burst of clarity, she lunged for the glowing pendulum of the clock, yanking it with all her strength. The green light flared, and for a moment the whispers returned, a cacophony of screams that nearly drove her to her knees. "No," Victor screamed, his form flickering as if he were being torn apart. "You can't break the connection. The ritual must be completed." Emily ignored him, focusing all her energy on disrupting the symbols on the floor. Using the heel of her boot, she scuffed the lines, breaking the intricate pattern. The moment she did, the floor beneath her began to tremble, cracks spider-webbing outward. The clock's chime became erratic, like a heart struggling to beat. Victor howled in rage, lunging at her with outstretched claws. But as he reached her, his form began to dissolve, turning into black smoke. "You cannot escape," he screamed, his voice echoing through the collapsing chamber. "The house will not let you go." Emily staggered back, watching as Victor was sucked into the cracks in the floor, his screams fading into the distance. The grandfather clock shattered, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. The room itself began to collapse, the walls folding inward as if the house were trying to crush her. Time was slipping away. The ground beneath her feet buckled, and she fell, tumbling through darkness. The mansion's grip was weakening, but it wasn't letting her go without a fight. As she fell, she saw glimpses of other rooms, other victims who had been trapped here, their faces twisted in agony. The mansion was trying to reclaim her, to drag her back into its depths. But Emily was done running. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the last piece of chalk she had found in the ritual chamber. As she fell through the void, she drew the protective sigil in the air, hoping against hope that it would be enough. The moment the symbol was completed, a blinding flash of light erupted around her, and she hit the ground hard. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers were gone, the darkness receding. She lay there, gasping for breath, unsure if she was still alive. Slowly, she opened her eyes. She was back in the foyer of the mansion, the first rays of dawn breaking through the shattered windows. The house was still, eerily quiet, as if it were finally at rest. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, her mind a whirlwind of exhaustion and relief. She had done it. She had severed the connection, broken the ritual. The house no longer had power over her. But as she turned to leave, the grandfather clock in the hallway gave one final, shuddering chime. It was 3:33 a.m., and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her, waiting for her to make her final move. The eerie chime of the grandfather clock echoed through the empty halls of the mansion, sending shivers down Emily's spine. The sound seemed to reverberate in her bones, a cruel reminder that even though she had disrupted the ritual, the house was far from done with her. The clock had struck 3:33 a.m. once more, a time that had become synonymous with the missing hours she couldn't account for, with the sinister darkness that gnawed at her mind. Emily stood in the foyer, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. The house was quieter now, its oppressive energy momentarily weakened, but she could feel it stirring, regaining its strength. The silence wasn't a reprieve, it was the calm before the storm. "You can't stay here," she whispered to herself, forcing her feet to move. "You have to leave, now." But as she turned to the front door, the shadows in the foyer thickened, swirling like dark clouds gathering before a storm. The air grew colder, and the familiar sound of whispers began to seep into her mind once more. This time, however, they weren't faint, disembodied voices. They were clear, distinct, and worst of all, they were in her own voice. "You can't leave, Emily," the voices murmured. "This is your home. You belong here." Emily's breath hitched as a wave of nausea washed over her. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. It felt like 100 different versions of herself were speaking in unison, trying to drown out her thoughts. She clutched her head, her knees buckling, and collapsed onto the cold marble floor. "Don't fight it," the voices urged. "You are one with the house now. Let it in, let it take you." "No," Emily screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to stop the onslaught of whispers. They weren't coming from the outside. They were inside her head, slithering through her thoughts like serpents, coiling around her memories, squeezing tighter and tighter. She needed to move, to get out of this house, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the mansion had reached inside her, taking control of her limbs, her very will. A sudden sharp pain lanced through her skull, and her vision blurred. For a horrifying moment she could see herself not through her own eyes, but from above, as if she were watching herself from the ceiling. "You see," the voices crooned, "we are becoming one." The floor beneath her began to ripple like the surface of a black lake, and Emily felt herself sinking, as if the house itself were swallowing her whole. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone, trapped in her throat. Darkness closed in around her, and she was falling into the depths of the house, where the shadows writhed and pulsed like a living thing. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the foyer. The room she found herself in was vast and cold, its walls covered in a thick layer of frost that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She recognized it instantly. It was the same room she had glimpsed in the shards of the shattered mirror, the one where her reflection had taunted her with that horrible, mocking grin. And now she was here, in the flesh. The walls of the room were covered in mirrors, each one reflecting different versions of herself. In one, she was standing still, her eyes wide with terror. In another, she was grinning maniacally, her teeth sharp and jagged. In yet another, her face was twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and lifeless. The reflections began to speak, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of madness. "Why do you resist? It would be so much easier to let go. You're already one of us, Emily. The house owns you. You're not real. You're just another shadow." Emily clutched her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what was real anymore. Was she still herself, or had she become just another echo, another lost soul trapped in this hellish house? She tried to close her eyes, to shut out the nightmarish reflections, but they only grew louder, screaming her name, calling her to join them. "Focus, Emily," she whispered to herself, her voice barely more than a rasp. "You're still here. You're still you." She forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking like they were made of glass. The room seemed to shift and sway around her, the mirrors warping, stretching into grotesque shapes. She had to find a way out, to break free of whatever illusion the house had trapped her in. With a surge of adrenaline, she turned and ran toward the far end of the room, where she could see a faint, flickering light. The reflections screamed in rage as she moved, their glassy eyes widening with fury. The ground beneath her feet shifted like quicksand, trying to pull her down, but she pushed forward, her desperation lending her strength. The light led her to a narrow passageway that seemed to materialize out of thin air. She didn't question it, she just kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were quieter here, more distant, as if the house were struggling to maintain its grip on her. Finally, she burst through another set of double doors and found herself back in the basement ritual chamber. The stone altar stood at the center, the remnants of the ritual she had disrupted still visible in the glowing symbols on the floor. But now, the symbols had changed, shifting and rearranging themselves into a new pattern, one she couldn't recognize. Victor's voice echoed through the chamber, low and mocking. "You think you can escape me, Emily? You are mine. The house has claimed you, body and soul." "No," she said through gritted teeth. "I won't let you take me." Victor's form materialized once again, but this time it wasn't just him. The shadows around him twisted and warped, taking on grotesque, shifting shapes, children with hollow eyes, twisted figures with faces contorted in agony, all reaching out for her. The ritual, the symbols. Emily realized with a jolt that the house wasn't just trying to possess her. It was trying to fully bind her soul, to turn her into another of its twisted guardians, like Victor. She was on the brink of becoming one of them, a puppet to be used to lure more victims into its depths. There was only one way to stop it. She grabbed the last remaining piece of chalk from her jacket pocket, her hands trembling, and began to draw a counter symbol on the stone floor. As she worked, the shadows shrieked, the room vibrating as if it were about to collapse. Victor lunged at her, his eyes burning with hatred, but she ignored him, focusing on the lines, the curves, the ancient words that would sever the bond. As she completed the last stroke, a blinding light erupted from the symbol. The shadows around her writhed, their screams mingling into a deafening roar. Victor's form flickered, his face contorted in rage. "No," he howled. "You cannot break free. The house will never let you go." But Emily kept chanting, her voice steady, her will stronger than it had ever been. The light grew brighter, the shadows dissolving into wisps of smoke. The house itself seemed to groan in agony, the walls cracking, the floor splitting beneath her feet. Then, with one final scream, Victor disintegrated, his form torn apart by the light. The darkness that had filled the room was sucked into the ground, leaving behind nothing but silence. Emily collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, the chalk slipping from her fingers. The house was eerily quiet, its oppressive presence finally gone. But as she lay there, staring at the fractured ceiling, she knew it wasn't truly over. The house was weakened, but it wasn't defeated. And somewhere, deep in its rotting heart, it was still waiting, still hungry. Emily had severed its hold on her, but she was still trapped within its walls. And now, with Victor gone, the house's attention was focused entirely on her. There was one final confrontation left. She had to reach the core, the true heart of the mansion, and destroy it once and for all. Or she would never leave this place alive. Emily lay on the cold stone floor of the ritual chamber, the dim light from the broken ceiling above casting faint, shifting shadows around her. The air was thick with dust, the remnants of Victor's disintegrated form settling around her like black snow. She had severed his control, but the house itself still pulsed with a malevolent energy, a dark heartbeat that echoed in her mind. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Her body ached, her mind foggy from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. The house was still alive, still hungry, and it would never let her go unless she found its true heart and destroyed it. She had one chance left, one final attempt to sever the darkness that had infested this place. With a shaky breath, Emily gathered her bearings. The ritual chamber, once a place of fear, now felt empty like a hollow shell. The symbols she had drawn earlier were fading, the chalk lines dulling as the energy drained from them. The oppressive force that had suffocated her for days had withdrawn, like a predator slinking back into the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. As she made her way to the door, she noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from one of the cracks in the floor. Kneeling down, she peered into the darkness. Deep beneath the stone, a crimson light pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a beating heart. This was it, the true source of the house's power, hidden away in its depths. The journal had hinted at a final ritual chamber, one that had never been mapped, never recorded. It was where the original pact had been sealed, where Victor Holloway had summoned the darkness that now consumed the mansion. If she could find that place, she might have a chance to destroy the heart once and for all. But the house wasn't going to let her reach it without a fight. The moment Emily left the ritual chamber, the walls around her began to shift and groan. The once familiar hallways twisted like the coils of a serpent, doors slamming shut behind her, trapping her in a maze of endless corridors. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked ominously, threatening to give way at any moment. Ignoring the panic rising in her chest, Emily pushed forward, using every bit of strength she had left. She had come too far to turn back now. The house was trying to disorient her, to break her resolve, but she had learned its tricks. She knew that if she stayed focused, if she trusted her instincts, she could find her way to the heart. As she made her way through the twisting hallways, she began to notice something unsettling. The walls were no longer just rotting wood and crumbling plaster. They were pulsating like the walls of a living creature. Dark, tar-like veins snaked along the surfaces, pulsing with that same crimson glow she had seen in the ritual chamber. The house was transforming, revealing its true, monstrous nature. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied. They no longer taunted her, but instead pleaded, begged, screamed in voices that sounded disturbingly like her own. Emily, don't go, you'll never leave. Turn back, you can't fight it. Join us, become part of the house. But she shut them out, her mind focused on one thing, the glowing light beneath the floor. She had to reach it. It was the only way to stop this nightmare. At the end of a long, decaying corridor, she found a spiral staircase leading down into the depths of the mansion. The steps were uneven, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, as if no one had used them in centuries. The air grew colder, and the crimson glow intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily descended cautiously, her flashlight flickering as she made her way deeper into the bowels of the house. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from all around her. The sound was almost hypnotic, a dark lullaby that pulled at her mind, urging her to stop, to rest, to give in. She shook her head, forcing herself to keep moving. The chanting grew louder, and the air grew thicker, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself standing before a massive iron door covered in strange, writhing symbols that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. This was it, the final chamber. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed the door open, and the sound of chanting erupted into a deafening roar. The room beyond was vast and circular, much larger than any space she had seen in the mansion before. The walls were lined with grotesque statues, their eyes glowing with that same sickly crimson light. And in the center of the room was a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged stones. From its depths came the source of the pulsing glow, the heart of the house. It was no metaphor. The heart was a grotesque, pulsing mass of flesh and sinew, suspended above the pit by thick black veins that twisted and coiled like the roots of an ancient tree. The entire room throbbed with its rhythm, the walls vibrating with each pulse. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant beat that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. Emily approached cautiously, her heart racing. The closer she got, the more she could feel the house's malevolence pressing down on her, trying to crush her spirit. The air was thick with the screams of the souls it had consumed, their voices mingling with the chanting, forming a nightmarish symphony of despair. As she stood before the heart, she realized what she had to do. The house had bound itself to this grotesque organ, using it as a conduit to channel its power, to feed on the souls of its victims. If she could destroy it, she could sever the house's connection to the darkness, collapsing the gateway it had opened. But it wouldn't be easy. The heart was protected by a barrier of writhing shadows, tendrils that lashed out at her as she approached. The air crackled with dark energy, and she could feel the house fighting her, trying to push her away. Emily reached into her pocket, pulling out the last remaining vial of salt and the piece of chalk she had kept from the ritual chamber. With trembling hands, she began to draw the protective sigil on the floor around the heart, chanting the words she had memorized from Victor's journal. The shadows screamed in fury, thrashing against the barrier, but they couldn't reach her. The heart pulsed faster, its glow becoming blindingly bright as she completed the sigil. The room shook violently, cracks spreading across the walls and ceiling. Emily poured the salt onto the heart, and it let out a hideous, ear-piercing scream that nearly drove her to her knees. The heart convulsed, the veins snapping and flailing like the limbs of a dying beast. The crimson light began to fade, the rhythmic pulsing slowing, weakening. Emily grabbed the crowbar she had brought with her, and with every ounce of strength she had left, drove it into the heart's quivering mass. The effect was immediate. The heart exploded in a burst of black, viscous liquid, spraying her with blood that smelled of rot and despair. The entire room shuddered, the walls cracking and collapsing as the house began to tear itself apart. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by the howls of rage and pain from the trapped souls as they were finally released. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and Emily fell, tumbling into the darkness below. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of the house's dying scream, a sound so terrible it seemed to split the very air. Then there was nothing but silence. Emily's body hit the ground hard, and for a moment she lay there, unable to move, unable to think. Had she done it? Had she finally destroyed the house? Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. The crimson glow was gone, replaced by the faintest hint of dawn breaking through the cracks in the walls above. She had won, but at what cost? As she struggled to her feet, the house lay silent, its once living walls now nothing more than crumbling stone. She had destroyed its heart, severed its connection to the darkness, but she was still trapped inside. And somewhere, deep within the house's dying walls, she heard it, the faintest whisper. "We are not finished, Emily, not yet." The final confrontation awaited her, but she would face it as the sun rose, for the first time in days, breaking the darkness that had held her captive. Emily stood amidst the ruins of the mansion, the air heavy with dust and the stench of decay. The house was no longer the same entity that had tormented her for days on end. Its oppressive presence had weakened considerably, reduced to a mere echo. But despite the destruction she had wrought, she knew her ordeal was not yet over. The faint whisper she had heard, so soft it could almost be mistaken for the wind, still lingered in her mind. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the fractured windows, casting a weak, silvery light that cut through the darkness. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps it was truly over, that she had won. But deep down, a gnawing doubt kept her from letting her guard down. The house was dying, yes, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. And she knew it would do everything in its power to take her down with it. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, as she forced herself to move through the debris. The crimson glow that had filled the mansion was gone, replaced by a dull gray light that seemed to sap the color from everything around her. The walls no longer pulsed with life, and the whispers that had filled her mind had faded to a distant murmur, like the dying gasps of a wounded beast. Emily navigated through the rubble-strewn hallways, her flashlight flickering weakly. She needed to find the front door, to make her way out before the entire structure collapsed. But as she turned a corner, she came face to face with something that made her blood run cold. The doorway that led to the foyer had been replaced by a mirror. This wasn't just any mirror. It was the same one she had shattered in her bedroom, the one that had shown her twisted reflections. But now, it was whole again, standing tall and menacing in the hallway as if it had never been broken. Its surface was smooth, dark, and impenetrable, reflecting not her current surroundings, but something else entirely. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer, her breath fogging up the glass. Instead of her own reflection, the mirror showed the mansion as it had once been, grand, opulent, alive with activity. The hallways were bustling with figures in old-fashioned clothing, their faces blurred, their movements jerky like the stuttered frames of an old film. The scene shifted, and she saw Victor Holloway standing at the center of the foyer, his eyes glowing with that sickly green light. His mouth moved, but she couldn't hear the words. He was surrounded by shadowy figures, women, children, and men, their faces twisted with fear and pain. It was a vision of the past, of the rituals that had sealed the mansion's fate. "This is where it all began," a voice whispered from behind her. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. The air was thick with an otherworldly chill, as if the mansion had one last breath left to exhale. She turned back to the mirror, and to her horror, the reflection had changed again. Now it showed her her own face, pale and exhausted, her eyes wide with fear. But behind her reflection there was movement. The shadows twisted and writhed, coalescing into the shape of Victor Holloway, his skeletal grin growing wider. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. "You think you can escape, Emily?" Victor's voice came from the mirror, echoing like a whisper in her mind. "You destroyed the heart, but the house lives through you now." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I severed the connection. You're gone. You can't control me." Victor's laughter was hollow, mocking. You are bound to this place, just as I was. You broke the heart, but you are now its vessel. The house needs a soul to sustain it, and you are the perfect host. Emily's knees buckled as the realization sank in. By destroying the heart, she hadn't freed the house. She had merely transferred its essence into herself. She was now the vessel, the last anchor that kept the darkness tethered to this world. No, she screamed, slamming her fists against the mirror. The surface rippled like water but did not break. I won't let you use me. I won't let you win. Victor's grin widened. It's too late. The house is dying, Emily. But you will live on, carrying its curse. You will become its new guardian, its new prisoner. The mirror's surface shimmered, and suddenly, Emily was no longer in the hallway. She was back in the grand foyer, but it was as it had been decades ago, pristine, glowing with the light of 100 candles. Figures moved around her, shadowy echoes of the past, whispering, laughing, crying. The air was thick with the scent of incense and blood. Victor stood before her, more solid than ever, his form no longer flickering. He extended a hand toward her, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Join me, Emily. Become one with the house. Embrace your destiny. Emily's mind reeled. She was trapped in an illusion, a twisted vision created by the house to break her spirit. But she couldn't let it win. She had one last chance to sever the bond, to destroy the mansion's hold on her once and for all. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the jagged shard of glass she had taken from the shattered mirror. It was the last weapon she had left. Victor's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized what she was about to do. Do you really think you can escape, child? He hissed. The house owns you. It will live on through you. Maybe, Emily said, her voice shaking but resolute. But not like this. With a cry, she drove the shard of glass into her own hand, carving the protective sigil she had memorized from Victor's journal into her palm. Pain shot through her, white-hot and blinding, but she didn't stop. She could feel the house's presence writhing within her, trying to resist, trying to maintain its grip. The air around her crackled with energy, the figures in the foyer screaming in unison. The walls trembled, the ground beneath her feet cracking open as the house struggled to hold itself together. Victor's form began to flicker, his face contorting with rage. You cannot sever the bond, he screamed, lunging toward her. But Emily's resolve held firm. She completed the sigil, and a wave of light erupted from her hand, blasting Victor backward. The house let out a deafening wail, the sound of 1,000 souls crying out in unison, as if the very foundation of the mansion was being torn apart. The light grew brighter, enveloping everything, swallowing the shadows, the screams, the darkness. Emily's body convulsed as the force of the ritual consumed her, tearing the house's presence from her soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, and Emily found herself lying on the cold ground outside the mansion. The first rays of sunlight were breaking over the horizon, bathing her in a warm, golden glow. The house behind her was nothing more than a crumbling ruin, its windows dark, its once mighty walls reduced to rubble. She had done it. She had severed the bond, destroyed the darkness that had bound the house to this world. But as she lay there, gasping for breath, she knew she was not unscathed. The whispers had stopped, but a faint echo remained, a shadow in the back of her mind that would never fully fade. She had escaped the house, but it had left its mark on her, a scar that would never heal. As she stood, the dawn breaking over the horizon, she turned to look at the ruins one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes watching her. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Emily turned away, leaving the cursed mansion